Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture deep into the forgotten highways of America with 8 disturbing tales that will make you question every roadside stop and small-town detour. In this episode, we will explore the twisted reality of cross-country travel through a collection of chilling accounts involving phantom population signs, synchronized diners, and the eerie patterns that emerge when travelers find themselves trapped on roads that refuse to let them leave. These stories have been compiled from first-hand testimonies of motorists who experienced the impossible along America's most desolate stretches of asphalt. Each narrative draws from documented incidents reported by those who survived encounters with the unexplained phenomena that lurk between destinations. The accounts detail everything from mysteriously identical establishments to population signs that seem to change before your very eyes, creating a tapestry of terror that spans multiple states and countless miles of abandoned highway. To ensure the safety and privacy of those who shared their experiences, certain names, locations, and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the authenticity of their terrifying encounters. If you are new to Buried Files, make sure to subscribe for daily deep dives into the most disturbing true stories that mainstream media will not touch. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of accounts that prove reality can be far more frightening than fiction. Evan Maddox was not expecting anything out of the ordinary when he took the old Highway 77 shortcut through Oklahoma on his solo road trip. He had driven from Chicago to Austin dozens of times for work, always taking the same interstate routes, but this time his GPS had malfunctioned just outside Tulsa, and he found himself following a series of state highways that promised to cut 2 hours off his usual drive time. The sun was beginning to set behind him as he passed through what appeared to be a string of forgotten towns, each one smaller and more weathered than the last. The first thing he noticed was how remarkably similar each town looked. Every settlement seemed to have the same basic layout: a main street with faded storefronts, a single traffic light that blinked yellow in all directions, and a small diner with neon signs that flickered intermittently in the growing dusk. But what really caught his attention were the population signs. Each town he passed through had the same green highway sign with white lettering, and each one read exactly the same thing: Population 1. At first, Evan assumed it was some kind of local joke or tourist gimmick. Maybe these tiny communities were making light of their dwindling numbers. Or perhaps it was an art project of some sort. He had heard of stranger things in small-town America, but as he continued driving, passing through what his odometer told him were at least 6 different municipalities, the identical signs began to feel less amusing and more unsettling. The names on the signs were different: Millfield, Crestview, Harmony Springs, Cedar Falls, but the population count never changed. When he pulled into the 7th town, a place called Riverside that sat alongside a creek that looked more like a muddy ditch, Evan decided to stop for coffee and ask someone about the signs. The town looked exactly like all the others: empty streets, a few scattered houses with darkened windows, and that same flickering diner sign advertising home cooking in red cursive letters. He parked in front of the diner and noticed that his rental car was the only vehicle on the entire street. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of old grease and burnt coffee. The interior looked frozen in time, with red vinyl booths, a black and white checkered floor, and a jukebox in the corner that was not playing any music. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his 70s, with thinning gray hair combed carefully over his scalp and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified his pale blue eyes. He wore a white apron that had seen better days and smiled at Evan with the practiced warmth of someone who had been greeting customers for decades. "Evening, stranger," the old man said, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Coffee?" Pie? We have got fresh apple today. Evan slid onto one of the counter stools and nodded. Coffee would be great, thanks, and maybe you can help me with something. I have been driving through these towns and all the population signs say the same thing. Population 1. Is that some kind of local tradition? The old man poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing for hours. The liquid was nearly black and steamed in a way that suggested it was still quite hot. Population 1, he repeated slowly as if testing the words. Well, I suppose that is accurate enough. There is just me here most of the time. Just you. But surely there are other people living here. I saw houses and someone must own this diner. Oh, I own the diner, the old man said, setting the cup down in front of Evan. Have for near on 40 years now. And you are right about the houses. There are folks who live in them, but they do not much care for visitors. Keep to themselves mostly, so when strangers come through like yourself, well, I am the only one they are likely to meet. Evan sipped the coffee and tried not to grimace at its bitter, almost metallic taste. That is interesting. And this happens in all the towns around here? The same population sign, I mean? The old man wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the counter. Cannot say I know much about the other towns. Do not get out much myself these days, but if the signs say population 1, well, I suppose that means there is one person willing to talk to travelers. He paused and studied Evan's face with those magnified eyes. You heading somewhere in particular? Austin? Evan replied, following the GPS shortcut, though I am starting to think it might not be much of a shortcut after all. Austin? The old man repeated, nodding slowly. Nice place. Been there once or twice. You will want to stay on this highway for another hour or so, then pick up the state route south. Should get you there just fine. Evan finished his coffee, left a few dollars on the counter, and headed back to his car. As he pulled away from the diner, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the old man standing in the doorway, watching him leave. The man raised his hand in a slow wave, and Evan waved back before turning his attention to the road ahead. 20 minutes later, he passed through another town with another identical population sign. This one was called Brookhaven, but everything else looked exactly the same. The main street, the traffic light, the darkened houses, and yes, even the diner with its flickering neon sign. On impulse, Evan pulled over and walked to the front window. Inside, he could see the same red vinyl booths, the same checkered floor, and behind the counter, the same elderly man in the white apron. Evan stood at the window for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. It had to be a different person. Perhaps the old man's brother or cousin. Small towns often had families that looked remarkably similar. But as he watched, the man behind the counter looked up and met his eyes through the glass. The man smiled and raised his hand in the exact same slow wave that Evan had received 20 minutes earlier in Riverside. He hurried back to his car and continued driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly than necessary. The rational part of his mind offered explanations. These were franchise diners designed to look identical. The man he had seen was probably an employee who worked at multiple locations, and the population signs were indeed some kind of regional marketing scheme. But as he passed through Millbrook, then Clearwater, then Pine Ridge, each with its own identical diner and its own glimpse of the same elderly man, Evan found it increasingly difficult to maintain his faith in rational explanations. By the time he reached the 9th town, he was no longer stopping. He had tried calling his girlfriend, his office, even his insurance company, but his phone showed no signal despite indicating full bars. The radio produced nothing but static no matter which station he tried. The sun had set completely now, and the only light came from his headlights and the occasional street lamp that worked well enough to cast weak pools of yellow illumination. The 10th town was called Sunset Grove, and as Evan drove through its empty main street, he saw something that made him slam on the brakes. In front of the diner, parked in the exact same spot where he had left his rental car in Riverside, was an identical silver sedan with the same license plate number as his own vehicle. Evan sat in his car, engine running, staring at what appeared to be his own rental car parked in front of a diner he was certain he had never visited. He got out slowly and walked to the other vehicle. The license plate was definitely identical to his own, down to the small scratch near the bottom right corner where he had scraped against a parking meter in Chicago. He peered through the windows and saw his own duffel bag on the back seat, his phone charger plugged into the dashboard outlet, and his coffee cup from that morning still sitting in the cup holder. The door to the diner opened, and the elderly man stepped out onto the sidewalk. He was no longer wearing his apron, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the light from the street lamp overhead. "Evening, stranger," he said in that same tremulous voice. "Been waiting for you to get back. Left your car here earlier, remember? Had coffee and pie, asked about the population signs." Evan backed away from the man, bumping into his own car, the one he had been driving. "I have never been here before." "That is not my car." The old man smiled and reached into his pocket, producing a set of keys that he held up for Evan to see. "Of course it is your car. Here are your keys. Left them on the counter when you paid for your coffee." He paused and tilted his head slightly, studying Evan's face with those pale, magnified eyes. "Though I suppose you might be confused. Happens sometimes to folks passing through. All these towns look the same after a while, easy to lose track of where you have been." "What is this place?" Evan whispered, looking around at the empty street, the darkened houses, the identical diner that he was absolutely certain he had seen in every town for the past 2 hours. "This is Sunset Grove," the old man replied. "Population 1. Always has been, always will be. And you, stranger, you are just passing through, like everyone else who takes this shortcut, round and round, town to town, looking for Austin. Most folks figure it out eventually." Evan ran back to what he thought was his car and fumbled with the door handle. It was locked. He patted his pockets frantically, but his keys were nowhere to be found. Behind him, he could hear the old man chuckling softly. "Keys are right here," the man called out, jangling them in the air. "But you might want to think about whether you really want to keep driving. After all, you have got at least a dozen more towns to get through before you reach Austin, and every single one of them has got a population of exactly 1. Jacob Dorsey had seen his share of cheap motels, but the Cuervo roadside lodge looked untouched since the 1950s. As a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative, he had stayed in hundreds of budget accommodations across the Southwest, from corporate chains to family-owned establishments that barely qualified as habitable. But nothing had prepared him for the string of identical motels he encountered during what should have been a routine drive from Albuquerque to Roswell on Interstate 40. The first motel appeared just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. Jacob had been driving for 3 hours and was starting to feel the familiar ache in his lower back that came from too many hours behind the wheel. The Sunset Motor Lodge sat alongside the highway like a relic from another era, its neon sign flickering weakly in the fading daylight. The building was a classic L-shaped structure with room doors painted turquoise and white, and a small office with a hand-painted sign advertising clean rooms, low rates. What caught Jacob's attention was not the motel itself, but the fact that it appeared to be completely occupied. Every parking space in front of the room doors contained a vehicle, and warm light glowed from behind every curtained window. This seemed unusual for such an isolated location, but Jacob was tired and the next town was still 40 miles away. He pulled into the office parking area and walked inside. The lobby was exactly what he expected from a motel of this vintage. Wood-paneled walls, orange shag carpeting, and furniture that had probably been stylish sometime during the Nixon administration. Behind the front desk stood a clerk who appeared to be in his 30s with carefully combed dark hair and a white shirt that looked freshly pressed despite the late hour. The man smiled with professional courtesy and spoke in a voice that carried a slight accent Jacob could not quite identify. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Sunset Motor Lodge. How can I help you tonight?" "I would like a room for one night," Jacob replied, setting his credit card on the counter. "Non-smoking if you have it available." The clerk consulted a ledger that looked decades old, running his finger down columns of handwritten entries. "I am afraid we are completely booked tonight, sir. Every room is occupied. Perhaps you might try the Desert Rose Motor Inn about 20 miles down the highway. They usually have availability." Jacob glanced through the window at the parking lot where he could indeed see vehicles parked in front of every room. Disappointed but not surprised, he thanked the clerk and returned to his car. 20 miles later, he found the Desert Rose Motor Inn, which looked remarkably similar to the Sunset Motor Lodge. Same L-shaped design, same turquoise and white paint scheme, same flickering neon sign. Even the landscaping appeared identical, with the same arrangement of desert plants and decorative rocks. The parking lot was also completely full, and when Jacob entered the office, he found himself facing what appeared to be the same desk clerk. The man had the same carefully combed dark hair, the same white pressed shirt, and the same slight accent. He smiled with identical professional courtesy and spoke the exact same words. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Desert Rose Motor Inn. How can I help you tonight?" Jacob stared at the man for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. "Are you the same person who was working at the Sunset Motor Lodge?" The clerk looked genuinely puzzled. "I am sorry, sir, but I do not know what you mean. I have been working here at the Desert Rose all evening. Are you looking for a room?" "Yes, but let me guess, you are completely booked." The clerk consulted his ledger with the same finger-down-the-column gesture Jacob had seen 20 miles earlier. "I am afraid that is correct, sir. Every room is occupied. Perhaps you might try the Roadrunner Motel about 15 miles down the highway. They usually have availability." Jacob left without another word and continued driving, but his confusion deepened when he found the Roadrunner Motel. It was identical to the previous two establishments in every detail he could observe. Same architecture, same color scheme, same neon sign, same fully occupied parking lot. And when he walked into the office, the same dark-haired clerk stood behind the same front desk, wearing the same white shirt and offering the same apologetic smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Roadrunner Motel. How can I help you tonight?" This time, Jacob decided to test his growing suspicion. "I am looking for a room, but I imagine you are going to tell me that you are completely booked and suggest I try another motel down the highway." The clerk's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been confusion, or perhaps annoyance. "That is correct, sir. We are fully occupied tonight. Perhaps you might try the Cactus Flower Inn about 18 miles down the highway. They usually have availability." Jacob drove to the Cactus Flower Inn, then the Tumbleweed Motor Court, then the Painted Desert Lodge. Each establishment was architecturally identical to the others, each had a fully occupied parking lot, and each was staffed by what appeared to be the same desk clerk offering the same apologetic explanation and the same suggestion to try the next motel down the highway. By the time Jacob reached the 7th motel, he was no longer surprised to find the same setup. But he was beginning to feel a creeping sense of anxiety that had nothing to do with his difficulty finding accommodation. At the Silverado Motor Inn, Jacob decided to walk around the building and peer through the windows of the occupied rooms. What he saw made his anxiety transform into genuine fear. Every room appeared to contain the same scene: a single bed with the same floral bedspread, the same wooden nightstand with the same brass lamp, and the same framed portrait hanging above the headboard. The portrait showed a woman in 1950s attire with dark hair and a serene expression, painted in the realistic style common to that era. But more disturbing than the identical room layouts was the complete absence of any actual occupants. Despite the vehicles parked outside and the warm light glowing from within, Jacob could not see a single person in any of the rooms. The beds were neatly made, the televisions were turned off, and there were no personal belongings visible anywhere. Yet somehow, these rooms were all supposedly occupied. He returned to the office and confronted the clerk directly. "There is nobody staying in those rooms. They are all empty." The clerk's professional smile remained unchanged. "I am sorry, sir, but that is incorrect. We are fully booked tonight. Our guests value their privacy and many of them retire early. Perhaps you might try the Desert Star Motel about 12 miles down the highway. They usually have availability." Jacob left the Silverado Motor Inn and drove through the night, encountering 6 more identical motels over the next 40 miles. Each one was staffed by the same clerk. Each was supposedly fully booked, and each had parking lots filled with vehicles that never seemed to move. At the Desert Star Motel, Jacob noticed that many of the cars in the parking lot were vintage models from the 1950s and 1960s, perfectly maintained but obviously decades old. Other vehicles appeared more modern but had license plates from states he had never heard of, with letter and number combinations that did not follow any system he recognized. As dawn approached, Jacob found himself at the 13th identical motel, the Atomic Age Motor Lodge. He was exhausted, confused, and beginning to question his own sanity. The lack of sleep combined with the repetitive encounters had created a dreamlike quality to the entire experience. When he walked into the office, the same clerk stood behind the same desk. But this time, something was different. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Atomic Age Motor Lodge. How can I help you tonight?" "It is morning now," Jacob pointed out, gesturing toward the windows where early sunlight was beginning to filter through. The clerk glanced toward the windows, and for the first time, his professional composure seemed to crack slightly. "Of course, sir. How can I help you this morning?" "I want to know what is happening here. I have been to 13 identical motels, all staffed by someone who looks exactly like you, all supposedly booked solid. But there is nobody actually staying in any of the rooms." The clerk set down his pen and studied Jacob's face with an expression that had lost all pretense of customer service politeness. "You have been driving all night, sir. Sometimes when people are very tired, they become confused about what they have seen and where they have been. I am not confused. Every motel on this highway is identical, and you are working at all of them." "That would be impossible, sir. I work only here at the Atomic Age Motor Lodge. I have been working this shift for—" The clerk paused and frowned as if trying to remember something important. "I have been working here for a very long time." Jacob leaned across the counter. "How long exactly?" The clerk's frown deepened, and he looked around the office as if seeing it for the first time. I am not certain. Time moves differently here in the desert. Days blend together, especially during the night shift." "What year is it?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse the clerk. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He looked at the calendar on the wall, but it showed only a generic desert landscape photograph with no visible date. The year is... He shook his head slowly. I should know this. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Do you remember when you started working here? I started working here when... The clerk's voice trailed off and his professional demeanor began to dissolve completely. I remember putting on this shirt. I remember someone showing me how to use the ledger. But I cannot remember who showed me or when it happened, or what I was doing before. The man behind the counter was no longer a clerk, but something else entirely. Something that had been playing the role of a clerk for so long that the performance had become its reality. Jacob backed toward the door, understanding finally that he had stumbled into something far more disturbing than a case of identical architecture. The guests in the rooms, Jacob said quietly. They are not really there, are they? The clerk, or whatever he was, looked at Jacob with eyes that held a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The guests. Yes, the guests. They check in, but they never seem to... He looked toward the hallway that led to the rooms and his voice became a whisper. I cannot remember any of them ever checking out. Jacob left the Atomic Age Motor Lodge and drove directly back to Albuquerque, taking the interstate and avoiding all small highways. He never returned to that stretch of road, and he never found any reference to those motels in travel guides or online reviews. But sometimes, late at night, when he is staying in yet another budget accommodation, Jacob finds himself studying the desk clerk's face, wondering if their smile is a little too professional, their courtesy a little too perfect, and whether they remember exactly how long they have been working the night shift. When Nicole Granger stopped for gas after midnight at a shuttered station in Allen Reed, Texas, stray dogs began appearing around her car. She had been driving for nearly 12 hours straight, pushing through the panhandle on her way to Denver for a job interview that could change everything. The position at the architectural firm was exactly what she had been working towards since graduation, and she could not afford to be late. That was why she had chosen to drive through the night instead of stopping at a motel, relying on truck stop coffee and sheer determination to keep her eyes open. The gas station looked like it had been abandoned for years. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and the pumps were covered with plastic bags and out-of-order signs. But her fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and according to her GPS, this was the only station for another 40 miles. She pulled up to the least damaged-looking pump and tried her credit card, knowing it would not work but hoping anyway. The screen remained dark and lifeless as she sat in her car, debating whether to risk continuing on her current fuel level. Nicole noticed movement in her peripheral vision. A dog had emerged from behind the abandoned service bay, a medium-sized mutt with patchy brown and white fur that looked like it had not seen a good meal in weeks. The animal approached her car slowly, not with the typical eager friendliness of a stray hoping for food, but with a deliberate, almost calculated gait that made her uncomfortable. She locked her doors instinctively, though she felt foolish for being afraid of what was obviously just a hungry stray. But as she watched, more dogs began to appear. They came from different directions, behind the building, from the tall grass alongside the highway, from underneath the canopy that covered the defunct pumps. Within minutes, she counted at least 8 dogs of various sizes and breeds, all moving with that same purposeful stride, all positioning themselves in a loose circle around her Honda Civic. Nicole tried to start her car, thinking she could coast to the next town if necessary, but the engine turned over weakly and died. She tried again with the same result. The fuel gauge now read completely empty, though she was certain it had shown at least a few miles remaining when she had first pulled in. Through her windshield, she could see the dogs watching her with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. Their eyes reflected her headlights in a way that seemed too bright, too focused. One of the dogs, a large German Shepherd mix with scars across its muzzle, began to pace back and forth in front of her car. As it moved, Nicole noticed something that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. The dog was not pacing randomly. It was walking in a perfect straight line, turning at precise 90-degree angles, creating a rectangular pattern that resembled the methodical patrol of a trained guard. When it completed one circuit, another dog, this one a smaller border collie mix, began its own pacing pattern perpendicular to the first. Within minutes, all 8 dogs had organized themselves into what could only be described as a coordinated surveillance formation. Some paced in geometric patterns, others sat at specific intervals around her car, and 2 positioned themselves directly behind her vehicle, blocking any possibility of backing up. Their behavior was unlike anything Nicole had ever seen from stray animals. There was no whimpering, no tail wagging, no typical canine body language. They moved and positioned themselves with military precision. She tried her cell phone, hoping to call for help, but found no signal despite being on a major highway. The phone showed full bars but could not connect to any network. As she held the device up to get a better look at the screen, one of the dogs, a medium-sized mixed breed with distinctive black and tan markings, stood up on its hind legs and placed its front paws against her passenger window. The dog was tall enough that its face was level with hers, and when their eyes met, Nicole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. The dog maintained eye contact for what felt like several minutes, its head tilted at an angle that seemed too human, too calculating. Then it dropped back down to all fours and resumed its position in the formation. But now all the dogs were looking directly at her car, their heads turned toward her with unblinking attention. Nicole decided to try honking her horn to scare them away, but when she pressed the button, no sound emerged. She tried the hazard lights, the radio, even the interior dome light. Nothing electronic in her car seemed to be functioning except the digital clock on her dashboard, which continued to blink 12:47 a.m. repeatedly, never advancing to 12:48. As she sat trapped in her powerless vehicle, surrounded by the unnaturally organized pack of strays, Nicole began to notice other details that increased her growing sense of dread. The dogs were not breathing visibly despite the cool temperature that should have made their breath visible in the night air. Their fur appeared to be the exact same length and texture despite being different breeds. Most disturbing of all, when one dog moved, the others would turn their heads to track its movement in perfect synchronization, like a flock of birds responding to an invisible signal. She tried to convince herself that she was experiencing some kind of sleep deprivation hallucination. 12 hours of driving could certainly affect perception and judgment. But the dogs remained stubbornly real, their formation maintaining perfect organization even as they shifted positions every few minutes. The German Shepherd mix completed another rectangular patrol and was immediately replaced by a different dog that walked the exact same pattern at the exact same pace. Around what her stuck clock insisted was still 12:47 a.m., Nicole heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Relief flooded through her as headlights appeared in her rearview mirror, growing larger as a pickup truck approached from the direction she had come. She began flashing her headlights, hoping to signal for help, surprised when they suddenly worked again. The truck slowed and pulled up alongside her car. The driver was a middle-aged man in a denim jacket who rolled down his window and called out to her, "Car trouble, miss?" "I am surrounded by these dogs," Nicole called back, pointing to the animals that were still maintaining their formation around her vehicle. "They have been here for almost an hour and my car will not start." The man looked around, scanning the area where Nicole could clearly see the 8 dogs positioned in their geometric patterns. He frowned and looked back at her with an expression of confusion. "Dogs? I do not see any dogs out here, miss. You sure you are feeling all right?" Nicole stared at him in disbelief. The dogs were clearly visible in the light from both their vehicles. The German Shepherd mix was less than 10 feet from the man's truck, standing perfectly still and staring directly at Nicole's car. "They are right there," she insisted, pointing again. 8 of them. "They have been surrounding my car." The man followed her gesture and shook his head slowly. "Miss, there is nothing out here but empty pavement and some tumbleweeds. Maybe you have been driving too long. Sometimes the mind plays tricks when you are overtired." As if responding to some unseen signal, all 8 dogs simultaneously turned and began walking away from Nicole's car. They moved in perfect formation, maintaining their spacing and coordination as they disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the headlights. Within 30 seconds, they were completely gone, leaving no trace that they had ever been there. Nicole tried her ignition again, and this time her car started immediately. The fuel gauge showed a quarter tank, and all her electronics were functioning normally. Her clock read 12:48 a.m. and continued advancing as usual. She thanked the man profusely, and he followed her to the next town to make sure she was safe, never mentioning the dogs again. But Nicole's relief was short-lived. As she continued toward Denver, passing through a series of small Texas towns connected by long stretches of empty highway, she began to see the dogs again. First just 1 or 2 at the edge of her headlight beams, then larger groups positioned alongside the road. They never approached her car directly, but they were always there, watching from the shadows, maintaining that same unnatural coordination. In Claude, she stopped at a 24-hour truck stop and mentioned the dogs to the cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s. "Stray dogs? Honey, we do not have any stray dogs around here. County keeps pretty tight control on that sort of thing." But when Nicole looked out the window of the store, she could see at least 6 dogs positioned in the parking lot, all facing her rental car, all perfectly still. By the time she reached Amarillo, Nicole had counted the same 8 dogs in every town she passed through. Always the same breeds, always the same formation, always that same eerie coordination, and always invisible to everyone except her. The German Shepherd mix with the scarred muzzle, the Border Collie with the intelligent eyes, the black and tan mixed breed that had stood against her window. They followed her route like a supernatural escort, appearing and disappearing but never truly leaving. She never made it to her job interview in Denver. Instead, Nicole turned around in Amarillo and drove straight back to Oklahoma, taking the interstate and avoiding small towns entirely. But even now, 6 months later, she occasionally sees them in her neighborhood. Always watching, always coordinated, always just visible enough to remind her that some roads lead to places where the normal rules do not apply, and some encounters follow you long after you think you have escaped. Lillian Pierce pulled off Route 66, hungry and desperate, only to find every diner with the same 3 waitresses and identical jukeboxes. She had been driving for 16 hours straight from Phoenix to Chicago, pushing through Arizona and New Mexico on what was supposed to be a simple relocation trip for her new marketing job. The moving truck with all her belongings had left 3 days earlier, and she was following in her Honda with just a suitcase and her laptop, planning to make the drive in 2 days with an overnight stop in Amarillo. But everything had gone wrong from the moment she left Phoenix. First, her usual route was blocked by construction that her GPS had not accounted for. Then a minor fender bender had cost her 2 hours dealing with insurance and police reports. By the time she found herself on the old Route 66 through New Mexico, it was nearly midnight and she had not eaten a proper meal since breakfast. Her stomach was cramping with hunger, and she knew she needed food and coffee if she was going to make it safely to her planned stop. The first diner appeared like a beacon in the darkness, its neon sign casting red and blue light across the empty highway. Mel's Diner, glowed in cursive script above a classic streamlined building that looked like it had been transplanted directly from the 1950s. Through the large windows, Lillian could see warm yellow light and what appeared to be a busy interior. She pulled into the gravel parking lot, grateful to finally find a place that was still open at this late hour. Inside, the diner was exactly what she expected. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, chrome fixtures, and the lingering aroma of grilled meat and fresh coffee. What struck her immediately was how perfectly preserved everything looked, as if the entire establishment had been frozen in time during the Eisenhower administration. Even the jukebox in the corner was an authentic Wurlitzer with bubble lights and chrome detailing that gleamed under the fluorescent lighting. 3 waitresses worked the dining room, and Lillian found herself studying them with the eye of someone who had spent years in customer service herself. The first was a blonde woman in her 30s wearing a pink uniform with white trim. Her hair styled in perfect victory rolls that framed a face with bright red lipstick and expertly applied makeup. The second waitress appeared to be in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and a blue uniform identical in style to the blonde's pink one. The third was younger, maybe early 20s, with auburn hair in a ponytail and a green uniform that completed the trio's color coordination. All 3 moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, carrying coffee pots and order pads, calling out to the cook through the service window, and chatting with customers who seemed to be locals based on their casual familiarity with the waitresses. Lillian slid into a booth near the window and waited for service, watching the choreographed dance of the dinner rush even at this late hour. The blonde waitress approached her table with a bright smile and a coffee pot already in hand. "Evening, honey. Welcome to Mel's. Coffee to start you off?" "Please," Lillian replied, turning over the heavy ceramic mug that sat waiting on the table. "And could I get a menu?" "Of course, sugar." The waitress filled her cup and produced a laminated menu from her apron pocket. "Everything on the breakfast menu is available all night, and we have got fresh pie, apple, cherry, and chocolate cream. I would recommend the meatloaf special if you are looking for something hearty." Lillian ordered the meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, along with a slice of apple pie. The food arrived quickly and was surprisingly good. Comfort food prepared exactly the way it should be, with generous portions and flavors that reminded her of her grandmother's cooking. She ate hungrily while listening to the ambient sounds of the diner, the sizzle of the grill, the clink of silverware against plates, the soft murmur of conversation, and the occasional song from the jukebox. After finishing her meal and paying the check, Lillian felt refreshed and ready to continue driving. She had gained back some time and felt confident about reaching Amarillo before dawn. But 25 miles down the highway, she encountered another diner that made her do a double take. Betty's Cafe announced itself in the same cursive neon script, housed in the same streamlined building design, with the same large windows revealing the same warm yellow interior lighting. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled into the parking lot to take a closer look. Through the windows, she could see the same red vinyl booths, the same black and white checkered floor, and the same chrome Wurlitzer jukebox positioned in exactly the same corner location. More remarkably, the same 3 waitresses were working the dining room, the blonde in pink, the brunette in blue, and the redhead in green, moving with the same practiced efficiency she had observed at Mel's. Lillian pushed through the front door and was greeted by the blonde waitress, who approached with the same bright smile and the same coffee pot already in hand. "Evening, honey. Welcome to Betty's. Coffee to start you off?" The voice was identical. The greeting was word for word the same, and when Lillian accepted the coffee and asked for a menu, the waitress produced the exact same laminated card from her apron pocket. The menu was identical in every detail, down to the prices and the brief descriptions of each dish. Even the specials were the same: meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans, and fresh pie and apple, cherry, and chocolate cream varieties. "Have you worked at Mel's Diner?" Lillian asked, studying the waitress's face for any sign of recognition. The blonde woman looked puzzled. "I am sorry, honey, but I do not know any Mel's. I have been working here at Betty's for, well, seems like forever. Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes?" Lillian ordered coffee and apple pie, watching the waitresses move through their routines with growing fascination and unease. Every gesture, every interaction with other customers, every call to the cook through the service window was identical to what she had observed at the previous diner. When the dark-haired waitress dropped a fork and bent to pick it up, Lillian remembered seeing the exact same action performed by what appeared to be the same woman 25 miles earlier. She left Betty's Cafe and continued driving, but 15 miles later encountered Ruby's Diner, housed in the same building design with the same neon signage and the same interior layout. The same three waitresses worked the same shifts, offered the same menu, and spoke the same words with the same inflections. At Ruby's, Lillian tried a different approach. "I was just at Betty's Cafe," she told the blonde waitress. "Do you remember me?" "I am sorry, honey, but I think you might be confused. I have been working here at Ruby's all evening. This is my first time meeting you." The waitress's smile never wavered, but something in her eyes suggested a fleeting moment of uncertainty, like someone trying to remember a half-forgotten dream. Over the next 40 miles, Lillian encountered 6 more diners: Alice's Kitchen, Dolly's Diner, Rose's Cafe, Maxine's Restaurant, Pearl's Diner, and Stella's Kitchen. Each was architecturally identical. Each featured the same 3 waitresses in their color-coordinated uniforms, and each offered the same menu with the same specials. The conversations she overheard were identical word for word. The songs playing on the jukeboxes followed the same sequence, and even the arrangement of customers in the booths appeared to follow the same pattern. At Stella's Kitchen, the 9th identical diner, Lillian decided to conduct an experiment. She ordered the meatloaf special again and paid careful attention to every detail of the service and the food preparation. The blonde waitress called her order to the cook using the exact same phrasing she had used at every previous diner. The food arrived after the exact same interval, plated in the exact same arrangement, and tasted exactly the same as it had 8 diners earlier. But when Lillian bit into the mashed potatoes, she found something that should not have been there: a small piece of metal that looked like part of a dental filling. She had found the exact same foreign object in her mashed potatoes at Mel's Diner, the first stop of the evening. She had removed it discreetly and said nothing to avoid causing a scene, but finding the identical object in food prepared hours later and miles away was impossible to explain through coincidence. She showed the metal piece to the blonde waitress, who examined it with the same expression of concern and the same apologetic words she had used at Mel's. "Oh my goodness, honey, I am so sorry about that. Let me get you a fresh plate right away, and of course there will be no charge for your meal." "You said the exact same thing at Mel's Diner," Lillian told her. "Word for word." The waitress looked confused and slightly distressed. "I do not know what you mean, honey. I have never worked at any place called Mel's. I have been here at Stella's for—" She paused and her professional composure began to crack. "I have been here for— How long have I been here?" The question seemed to genuinely puzzle her, and she looked around the diner as if seeing it for the first time. "I remember starting my shift, but I cannot remember when that was. And I remember serving you before, but that does not make sense because this is the first time you have been here." Lillian left Stella's Kitchen and drove straight through to Amarillo without stopping, even when she passed 3 more identical diners along the way. But the experience had shaken her more than she cared to admit. and for weeks afterward she found herself questioning the reality of routine interactions. Whenever she encountered friendly, efficient service at restaurants, she wondered if the employees truly remembered her from previous visits, or if they were simply performing the same scripted interactions they had been repeating for longer than anyone could remember. Derek Fox's phone died just past Goffs, California, and the road suddenly emptied of all traffic. He had been driving from Las Vegas to Los Angeles on what should have been a routine trip to meet with potential investors for his tech startup, but a wrong turn near Needles had led him onto a series of increasingly desolate back roads through the Mojave Desert. The GPS on his phone had been acting erratically for the past hour, recalculating his route every few minutes and directing him through ghost towns and abandoned settlements that did not appear on any map he could find. Goffs was the kind of place that existed more as a historical footnote than an actual community. Once a thriving railroad town during the early 20th century, it now consisted of little more than a few weathered buildings, a defunct general store, and a population sign that read, Goffs, Population 23 in faded green lettering. Derek had stopped there briefly to check his directions, but when he tried to restart his phone after it died, nothing happened. The device was completely unresponsive despite having shown a full charge just minutes earlier. What disturbed him most was the sudden absence of traffic. For the past 2 hours, he had been sharing the road with a steady stream of vehicles, trucks, RVs, and cars making their way between California and Nevada. But the moment his phone died, the highway became completely empty in both directions. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat and the whisper of wind across the desert sand. As Derek continued driving west, hoping to find a town large enough to have cell service and directions back to the interstate, he noticed that the population signs were changing. The first sign after Goffs read Fenner, Population 24. 20 miles later, he passed through what appeared to be the remains of Cadiz, where the sign announced Population 25. Each successive town showed an increase of exactly 1 person, despite the fact that most of these settlements consisted of nothing more than abandoned buildings and empty lots. By the time he reached a place called Amboy, the population sign read Population 31, and for the first time since leaving Goffs, Derek saw actual signs of human habitation. Lights were on in some of the buildings, and he could see movement behind the windows of what appeared to be a small cafe. But as he drove slowly through the main street, the people he glimpsed were all standing perfectly still, positioned at regular intervals along the sidewalks and in doorways. They were not engaged in any activity that would explain their presence. Not talking to each other, not waiting for transportation, not even looking around with the casual curiosity of people watching a stranger drive through their town. Instead, they stood motionless and silent, all facing the same direction, all watching Derek's car with the same unnaturally focused attention. Men, women, and what appeared to be a few teenagers, all dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date, all maintaining the same rigid posture. Derek slowed his car to get a better look at these silent observers, and as he did, he noticed that their eyes followed his movement with mechanical precision. When he turned his head to look at a group standing near what had once been a gas station, every person in the group turned their head at exactly the same angle to maintain eye contact. When he accelerated past a row of storefronts, the people positioned in front of each building stepped forward in perfect synchronization. At the edge of Amboy, another population sign announced the next town, Baghdad, population 32. But as Derek read the sign, he noticed something that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. Written in smaller letters beneath the population count in what appeared to be fresh black marker were the words, "Welcome Derek." He stopped the car and stared at the sign, trying to process what he was seeing. There was no logical explanation for how his name could appear on a highway sign in the middle of the Mojave Desert. He had not spoken to anyone since his phone died, had not provided identification to anyone, and had not even stopped his car until this moment. Yet there it was, written in block letters that looked like they had been added recently to an otherwise weathered sign. Derek got out of his car to examine the sign more closely, hoping to find some explanation for what he was seeing. As he approached, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps on gravel behind him. He turned around and saw that several of the silent figures from Amboy had followed him, walking in single file along the shoulder of the highway. They maintained their rigid posture and fixed stares, but they were definitely moving, closing the distance between themselves and his car at a steady, measured pace. He quickly got back in his car and continued driving toward Baghdad, but now he was being followed by what appeared to be an entire procession of silent figures. In his rearview mirror, he could see them walking in perfect formation along the center line of the highway, moving faster than any normal walking pace would allow. They covered ground with the mechanical efficiency of machines, never breaking stride, never changing their synchronized movement. Baghdad turned out to be slightly larger than Amboy, with more buildings and more lights, but the same eerie population of motionless figures positioned throughout the town. The population sign at the entrance read Population 32. But as Derek drove past, he saw the number change to 33, the digits physically rotating like those on an old mechanical odometer. At the exit sign, new text had appeared. "Thanks for visiting, Derek. Drive safely." The pattern continued through Essex, Ludlow, and Newberry Springs. Each town showed a population count that was exactly one higher than the previous settlement, and each town's signs included personal messages addressed to him by name. "Derek is welcome in Essex, population 34. Ludlow appreciates Derek's visit, population 35. Newberry Springs hopes Derek will stay, population 36. But more disturbing than the personalized signs was the growing number of silent figures that populated each town. In Essex, there were dozens of them positioned along the main street. In Ludlow, they filled the sidewalks and stood in organized rows in empty lots. By the time he reached Newberry Springs, there were hundreds of motionless figures watching his progress, all maintaining that same unnatural stillness, all turning their heads in unison to track his movement. As darkness fell, Derek noticed that the figures were becoming more active. They no longer remained perfectly stationary, but began moving in coordinated patterns, like the pieces of some vast chess game being repositioned by an invisible hand. Groups would march from one location to another in perfect formation, then assume new positions and return to their motionless vigil. The sound of their synchronized footsteps created an unsettling rhythm that seemed to keep pace with his heartbeat. At Yermo, the population sign read Population 42, and the message beneath it had changed. Derek should consider staying permanently. For the first time since leaving Goff's, he saw other vehicles on the road, cars and trucks parked in neat rows throughout the town, all empty, all covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested they had been there for some time. License plates from different states created a random pattern of origins: Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. Derek realized that these were the vehicles of other travelers who had taken the same wrong turn he had. Other people who had found themselves on this impossible route through towns that adapted themselves to their presence. The silent figures were not residents of these communities, but visitors who had arrived before him, transformed into part of the strange ecosystem that populated this stretch of desert highway. As he approached the sign marking the exit from Yermo, Derek saw that the population count had changed again. It now read Population 43, and beneath it, in fresh black letters, "Welcome home, Derek." He pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach a real town with real people and working communication. But the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly through the desert. Behind him, the procession of silent figures had grown into a massive crowd that filled the highway from shoulder to shoulder. They moved with that same mechanical precision, but now they were gaining on him despite his increased speed. When his fuel gauge dropped to a quarter tank, Derek began to panic. He had been driving for hours through impossible towns populated by silent watchers, and he had no idea how to escape the loop he had found himself trapped within. Every sign pointed to more settlements ahead, each promising a population count one higher than the last, each offering increasingly insistent invitations for him to stay. At Barstow, which according to its sign now had a population of 44, Derek made a desperate decision. Instead of continuing on the main road, he turned onto what appeared to be a service road leading back toward the interstate. The road was unmarked and poorly maintained, but it headed in the right direction and seemed to offer a way out of the endless succession of ghost towns. But as he drove down the service road, Derek noticed that the landscape around him was changing. The desert was giving way to suburban neighborhoods complete with streetlights and manicured lawns. Children played on sidewalks, families grilled dinner in their backyards, and normal traffic moved along tree-lined streets. It all looked perfectly ordinary except for one detail. Every person he could see, from the children on the sidewalks to the families in their yards, stood perfectly motionless and stared directly at his car as he passed. A sign at the entrance to the suburban area read, "Welcome to Derek's neighborhood, Population 1. Driving east from Springfield, Missouri on a stormy evening, Blair Rowe kept hearing phantom church bells near every crossroads. She had left her apartment in Springfield at sunset, planning to drive through the night to reach her sister's house in Arkansas for a family emergency. The storm had developed unexpectedly, turning what should have been a straightforward 5-hour drive into a treacherous journey through sheets of rain and flashes of lightning that illuminated the rural landscape in stark, unsettling moments. Blair had taken Highway 60 east, but construction detours and washed-out bridges had forced her onto a series of smaller state roads that wound through the Ozark foothills. Her GPS kept losing signal in the storm, leaving her to navigate by road signs and intuition through communities she had never heard of despite living in Missouri her entire life. The rain was so heavy that her windshield wipers could barely keep up, and she found herself driving well below the speed limit, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The first time she heard the bells, Blair assumed they were coming from her radio. A deep, resonant tolling that seemed to emanate from multiple sources, creating a complex harmony that rose and fell with each peal. But when she turned off the radio completely, the bells continued, growing louder as she approached what appeared to be a small town nestled in a valley between two hills. Through the rain and lightning, she could make out the silhouette of a church steeple rising above a cluster of modest buildings. The town was called Bellefonte, according to a weather-beaten sign that appeared briefly in her headlights. Population 187, established 1883. As Blair drove slowly down the main street, the church bells continued their haunting chorus, but she could not locate their source. The white clapboard church she had seen from the hill sat dark and apparently empty, its steeple outlined against the storm clouds but showing no signs of activity that would account for the persistent ringing. What she could see, illuminated by flashes of lightning, was a lone figure kneeling in the front pew of the church. The building's windows were tall and clear, offering an unobstructed view of the interior. And each lightning flash revealed the same scene: a woman in a dark dress, her head bowed in prayer, completely motionless despite the violent storm raging outside. Blair slowed her car to get a better look, but the next flash of lightning showed the church interior to be completely empty. As she reached the edge of Belafonte, the bells gradually faded, replaced by the steady drumming of rain on her roof and the rhythmic sweep of her windshield wipers. But 10 miles later, as she approached another crossroads marked by another small community, the bells began again. This time they seemed to be coming from multiple directions, as if several churches were all ringing their bells in response to some shared signal. The second town was called Harmony Ridge, and it followed the same pattern as Belafonte. A white church with a tall steeple dominated the small cluster of buildings, and lightning flashes revealed the same lone woman kneeling in the same front pew, her dark dress and bowed head creating an identical silhouette. But when Blair stopped her car directly in front of the church and waited for the next lightning flash, the woman was gone, leaving only empty pews and shadows. Blair began to feel a creeping anxiety that had nothing to do with the storm or her sister's emergency. She had lived in Missouri long enough to be familiar with rural church communities, but the persistence of the bells and the repeated sighting of the praying woman felt deeply wrong. Small towns did not ring their church bells during violent thunderstorms, and the same woman could not possibly be kneeling in multiple churches separated by miles of winding road. At the third town, Millfield Chapel, Blair made the decision to stop and investigate. She parked her car in front of the church and sat for several minutes, listening to the bells that continued to ring despite the apparent absence of anyone to operate them. The sound was definitely coming from the church building, but she could see no movement in the bell tower, no ropes being pulled, no mechanical apparatus that might explain the continuous tolling. Through the rain-streaked windows, lightning revealed the interior of the church in stark detail. Simple wooden pews arranged in neat rows, a plain altar at the front, and kneeling in the first pew, the same woman in the same dark dress maintaining the same posture of prayer. This time, Blair was determined to get a closer look. She grabbed her umbrella and ran through the rain to the church's front door. The door was unlocked, and Blair stepped inside to find herself in a typical rural church interior. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax, and everything appeared exactly as it had through the windows. But the front pew was empty. There was no sign that anyone had been kneeling there, no indication that the church had been occupied at any point during the evening. Yet the bells continued to ring overhead, their sound now deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Blair called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" but received no response other than the continuous tolling of the bells. She walked to the front of the church and examined the pew where she had seen the woman kneeling. The wood showed no signs of recent use, no indentation in the kneeling pad, no warmth that would indicate someone had been there moments before. But on the floor beside the pew, she found a small prayer book bound in black leather. Opening the book, Blair found that every page contained the same prayer written in careful script. "Lord, guide the travelers safely home through the storm. Protect them from the darkness that waits at the crossroads. Let them find sanctuary in your house." The prayer was repeated hundreds of times throughout the book, the handwriting becoming increasingly erratic toward the end, as if the writer had been growing more desperate or distressed with each repetition. Blair left the church and returned to her car, but now she could hear the bells from multiple directions simultaneously. Behind her, the bells of Millfield Chapel continued their steady tolling. Ahead of her, she could hear the bells of what must be the next town's church beginning their own rhythm. To the north and south, fainter bell sounds suggested that the entire region was filled with churches all ringing at once, creating a complex symphony of bronze and iron that rose above the storm. The pattern repeated at Mount Zion, Pleasant Valley, Cedar Grove, and Bethel Heights. Each town featured the same white church with the same tall steeple. Each had bells that rang continuously during her visit, and each revealed the same kneeling woman who vanished whenever Blair tried to approach. At Bethel Heights, she decided to test her growing suspicion by remaining parked in front of the church for a full hour. During that hour, Blair witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the church interior and reveal the woman kneeling in prayer. But the woman's position changed slightly with each flash, as if she were moving through the motions of a prolonged prayer session in stop-motion animation. Her head would lift slightly, then bow deeper. Her hands would clasp and unclasp. Her body would sway almost imperceptibly from side to side. When Blair finally left Bethel Heights, she made a disturbing discovery. Her car's clock, which had been working perfectly when she left Springfield, now showed the same time it had when she first entered Belafonte, 9:47 p.m. Despite having driven for what felt like several hours and visited multiple towns, no time appeared to have passed. Her phone was equally unreliable, showing no signal and a frozen timestamp that matched her car's clock. The bells continued to guide her from town to town, always growing louder as she approached each community and fading as she left, but never stopping completely. At Grace Chapel, the prayer book she found was identical to the one in Millfield Chapel, down to the same handwriting and the same increasingly frantic repetition of the same prayer. At New Hope Methodist, she discovered that the bells were actually coming from the steeple. But the bell tower was completely empty. No bells, no ropes, no mechanism that could produce the sounds she was hearing. As Blair drove through what must have been the 12th identical town, she began to understand that she was trapped in some kind of loop centered around the storm and the churches. Each community existed only long enough for her to experience the bells, witness the praying woman, and find the prayer book before the pattern reset and directed her toward the next crossroads. The woman in the dark dress was not a person, but a memory, endlessly repeating the same desperate prayer for travelers caught in storms just like the one Blair was experiencing. When she finally reached a town called Sanctuary Hills, Blair found that the church doors were locked, but taped to the front entrance was a handwritten note. "Blair, the bells will stop ringing when you stop running. The woman in the pew has been praying for you specifically. She knows your sister is safe. Go home." Blair stared at the note, which was written in the same careful script she had seen in all the prayer books. Somehow, the mysterious woman had known her name, known about her sister, known that she was driving through the storm because of a family emergency. When she looked through the church windows one last time, the woman was there in the front pew, but now she was looking directly at Blair and smiling. The bells stopped ringing. The storm began to clear. And when Blair checked her phone, she found 17 missed calls from her sister, all saying the same thing. The emergency had been resolved, everyone was fine, and she should turn around and go home. According to the timestamps, the calls had been coming in since 9:47 p.m. Tyrell Boone and his two companions struggled to find a working light past Amboy when dusk fell. Every lamppost flickered in unison. The three college friends had been driving from San Bernardino to Las Vegas for spring break, taking the scenic route through the Mojave Desert to avoid the crowded interstate. Tyrell was behind the wheel of his older brother's Jeep Cherokee, with Marcus riding shotgun and Devin stretched out in the back seat, all of them looking forward to a week of freedom before returning to their engineering studies at Cal Poly. They had stopped in Amboy earlier that afternoon to take pictures at the famous Roy's Motel and Cafe, the iconic Route 66 landmark that had been featured in countless movies and travel documentaries. The town was essentially a ghost town now, with just a few residents maintaining the historic buildings for tourists, but in the harsh desert sunlight it had possessed a certain nostalgic charm. Now, as evening approached and they found themselves still in the area due to a detour caused by a jackknife truck on the main highway, Amboy felt completely different. The change began subtly as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. Streetlights that had been invisible during the day began to flicker on throughout the small community, but instead of providing steady illumination, they pulsed in a synchronized pattern that was immediately noticeable and deeply unsettling. Every lamppost, every porch light, every illuminated sign followed the exact same rhythm. 3 seconds on, 1 second off, repeated endlessly. "That is weird," Marcus said, pointing toward the main street where a dozen lights were flashing in perfect unison. "Looks like they have got some kind of electrical problem." Tyrell slowed the Jeep and pulled over to get a better look at the phenomenon. The lights were not just flickering randomly. They were following a precise pattern that suggested either a coordinated system or a widespread electrical fault affecting the entire town. But even more strange was the fact that the lights in distant buildings, ones that should have been on separate electrical systems, were following the exact same rhythm. "Maybe we should ask someone about it," Devin suggested from the back seat. "See if they know what is going on." They drove slowly through Amboy's main street, looking for residents who might be able to explain the synchronized lighting, but the town appeared to be completely deserted. The few buildings that showed signs of habitation during their afternoon visit now seemed empty, with no vehicles parked outside and no movement visible through windows. Even Roy's cafe, which had been open for business a few hours earlier, was now dark except for its exterior sign, which flashed in the same 3-on-1 off pattern as every other light in town. As they reached the eastern edge of Amboy, Tyrell noticed something that made him pull over again. The synchronized flashing was not limited to the town itself. It extended in all directions as far as he could see. Power lines along the highway carried the pulsing pattern to distant structures. Streetlights at crossroads miles away flashed in the same rhythm, and even the lights of what appeared to be a radio tower on a distant hill followed the identical timing. "This has got to be some kind of grid failure," Marcus said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Maybe a power plant is having problems causing voltage fluctuations across the whole region." Tyrell tried his cell phone to see if he could find information about power outages, but discovered that his phone was receiving no signal despite showing full bars. Marcus and Devin checked their phones as well, with the same result. Perfect signal strength, but no ability to make calls or access data. The phones seemed to be connected to cellular towers, but those towers were not connecting to the wider network. They decided to continue toward their planned route, hoping to find a town with working communications, where they could get information about the electrical problems. But as they drove through the gathering darkness, the synchronized flashing followed them. Every light they encountered, streetlights, porch lights, illuminated signs, even the headlights of abandoned vehicles, pulsed in the same 3-second pattern. 20 miles past Amboy, they encountered a small desert community called Kelso that consisted primarily of a restored train depot and a few scattered buildings. The depot was supposed to be a visitor center for the Mojave National Preserve, but when they pulled into the parking area, they found it completely deserted. Every light in the complex flashed in the familiar pattern, but there were no park rangers, no tourists, no signs of recent human activity. Devin got out of the Jeep to check the visitor center, hoping to find a working phone or at least information about the power situation. The building was unlocked, and inside he found displays about desert wildlife, railroad history, and hiking trails, but no people and no working communication equipment. The phones were connected and showed dial tones, but calls to emergency services, their families, or even directory assistants failed to connect. "The phones work, but they do not go anywhere," Devin reported when he returned to the Jeep. "It is like the whole phone system is running, but it is not connected to the outside world." As they continued driving, Tyrell began to notice that the synchronized flashing was affecting more than just electrical systems. Traffic lights at intersections followed the same pattern, but they displayed all colors simultaneously. red, yellow, and green lights flashing together in the 3-on-1-off rhythm. Electronic billboards and digital signs showed the same pulsing pattern instead of their normal advertisements or messages. At a gas station in a place called Sema, they discovered that the electrical anomalies extended to payment systems and electronic devices. The fuel pumps were operational and showed prices, but the card readers pulsed with the same timing as the lights, displaying alternating screens of payment prompts and error messages. Cash transactions were impossible because the register drawer opened and closed in sync with the flashing, making it impossible to complete a purchase. "We need to get out of this area," Marcus said, studying their roadmap by the light of a flashlight that had started flickering in the same pattern as everything else. "Whatever is causing this, it is spreading. Our flashlight should not be affected by external power systems, but it is following the same timing." They tried to leave the affected area by taking a different route, heading south toward Interstate 40, but found that the synchronized flashing extended in all directions. Every town they passed through was caught in the same electrical anomaly, and every electronic device they encountered had been affected. Even their Jeep's headlights and dashboard lights were now pulsing in the 3-on-1-off pattern. At a truck stop near Needles, they encountered other travelers who were experiencing the same phenomenon. A family from Phoenix reported that their GPS had been showing impossible routes through towns that did not exist on any map. A couple from Utah said their car radio was receiving broadcasts from the 1950s, complete with advertisements for products that had not been manufactured in decades. A lone trucker claimed that every CB radio channel was carrying the same repeated message: "All travelers proceed to designated gathering point. Follow the lights." "Gathering point?" Tyrell asked. "What gathering point?" The trucker pointed toward the western horizon, where a concentration of flashing lights created a bright pulse visible even from miles away. "That direction. Every light is pointing that way, and every road seems to lead there eventually. I have been trying to get to Barstow for 6 hours, but every detour, every alternate route, they all curve back toward those lights." Tyrell, Marcus, and Devin decided to investigate the gathering point, partly out of curiosity and partly because their attempts to leave the area had been unsuccessful. Every road they tried seemed to lead them in a wide circle that gradually spiraled toward the concentration of lights on the western horizon. Their fuel gauge showed they had plenty of gas, but the needle pulsed with the same rhythm as everything else, making it impossible to know their actual fuel level. As they approached the source of the concentrated flashing, they found themselves in what appeared to be a temporary settlement that had sprung up in the desert. Hundreds of vehicles were arranged in concentric circles around a central area where the light pulses were brightest and most frequent. Cars, trucks, RVs, and motorcycles from across the Southwest were parked in organized rows, but there were no people visible anywhere. All the vehicles had their lights on: headlights, tail lights, hazard lights, interior lights, and all were flashing in perfect synchronization. The effect was hypnotic and overwhelming, creating a strobe light environment that made it difficult to focus on any single object or maintain normal depth perception. The sound was equally disturbing: hundreds of turn signals, hazard lights, and electronic warning systems clicking in unison, creating a mechanical rhythm that seemed to match their heartbeats. "Where is everyone?" Devin asked, getting out of the Jeep to investigate the nearest vehicles. The cars were empty but showed signs of recent occupation: keys in ignitions, personal belongings on seats, cell phones plugged into chargers. But there were no people anywhere in the gathering. As they walked among the empty vehicles, Tyrell noticed that each car's radio was tuned to the same frequency and broadcasting the same message on repeat. Phase 1 complete. All travelers have arrived at the designated coordinates. Phase 2 will commence at the designated time. Please remain with your vehicles. The message was spoken in a calm, professional voice that could have belonged to any radio announcer. But it was being broadcast simultaneously from hundreds of car radios, creating an echoing effect that made the words seem to come from the desert itself. And as they listened, Tyrell realized that the flashing lights were not random or caused by electrical failure. They were counting down to something. The 3-on-1-off pattern was not a malfunction but a timer, and as midnight approached, the pattern began to change. The lights pulsed faster, then slower, then in more complex rhythms that seemed to correspond to some kind of signal or code. And in the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, they could see other gathering points scattered across the desert, each one marked by the same concentration of synchronized flashing lights. "We need to leave," Marcus whispered. But when they returned to their jeep, they found that the engine would not start. The electrical system was fully operational, lights and radio working perfectly, but the starter remained silent. Around them, hundreds of other vehicles sat in the same condition, powered but immobilized, their owners nowhere to be found, all waiting for Phase 2 to begin. Valerie Riggs mapped ghost towns for a blog, but when every single population sign started adding her name, she realized she could not leave. For 3 years, she had been documenting the abandoned communities scattered across the American West, photographing empty buildings and researching the histories of places that time had forgotten. Her blog, Forgotten America, had developed a modest but dedicated following among urban explorers, history enthusiasts, and people who shared her fascination with places where life had once thrived but had long since moved on. This particular trip had taken her through Nevada and into Eastern California, following rumors of a cluster of ghost towns connected by an old mining road that supposedly offered some of the best preserved 19th century architecture in the region. She had started in Goldfield, Nevada, working her way south through settlements with names like Silver Peak, Lida, and Gold Point, each one providing material for detailed blog posts complete with historical photographs, population statistics, and GPS coordinates for other explorers who might want to visit. The first unusual sign appeared as she was leaving Gold Point, heading toward a place called Palmetto that was marked on her vintage maps but did not show up in modern GPS systems. The standard highway sign read Gold Point, Population 7, as she had expected. But underneath the official text, someone had added a hand-painted addendum in neat black letters. "Thanks for visiting, Valerie." She stopped her Toyota 4Runner and got out to photograph the sign, assuming it was either a coincidence or perhaps the work of locals who had recognized her from her blog. Small communities often took pride in visitors who documented their history, and it was not unusual for residents to leave messages for returning travelers. But when she examined the paint more closely, it appeared to have been applied with the same materials and techniques as the original sign, showing the same weathering and age that should have taken years to develop. Palmetto was exactly the kind of place Valerie specialized in documenting. A collection of sagging wooden buildings, rusted mining equipment, and empty lots marked only by crumbling foundations. According to her research, the town had been abandoned since the 1940s when the last mining operation shut down, leaving behind a population of 0 that had remained unchanged for 8 decades. But when she drove past the entrance sign, it read Palmetto, Population 0. "Welcome back, Valerie." The welcome back message troubled her because she had never been to Palmetto before. Her blog archives contained no mention of the town, her photographs showed no previous visits, and her GPS tracking history had no record of her ever being in this area. Yet the sign clearly indicated that this was not her first visit, written in the same official style as the population count and showing the same weathered appearance as if it had been there for years. She spent 2 hours in Palmetto photographing buildings and taking notes about the town's history, but found herself constantly looking back at the entrance sign. The message remained unchanged. but she noticed other details that had not been there when she first arrived. Small wooden signs posted throughout the town now bore messages clearly intended for her. Valerie, check the mine shaft behind the old store. Valerie, best photo opportunities at sunset. Valerie, don't forget to document the cemetery. Following the suggestions, she found exactly what the signs promised. The mine shaft contained some of the best preserved mining equipment she had ever photographed. The sunset lighting created dramatic shadows that made for compelling images. The cemetery held graves with unusual headstones that would provide excellent content for her blog. It was as if someone had prepared a customized tour specifically for her interests, but there was no one in Palmetto who could have done so. When she left Palmetto and continued south, the personalized signage followed her. At Montezuma, the population sign read, "Population 0, Valerie's favorite ghost town," despite the fact that she had never been there before. At Bonnie Claire, the sign announced Population 0 featured on Valerie's blog, though she had no memory of ever writing about the place. At Goldike, the message was more disturbing. Population 0, Valerie's permanent residence. Each town contained signs and markers that referenced her name, her blog, and details about her life that should not have been known to whoever was creating these messages. In Bonnie Claire, she found a bulletin board covered with printouts of her blog posts, including articles she was certain she had never written. The posts described visits to towns she had never heard of, included photographs she had never taken, and contained personal reflections in her own writing style about experiences she had never had. One post, dated 6 months in the future, described her decision to stop traveling and settle permanently in a ghost town whose name had been blacked out with marker. The writing was definitely hers. She recognized her own phrases, her own perspective, her own way of describing abandoned places, but she had no memory of writing it. According to the post, she had grown tired of constantly moving from place to place and had found a town that felt like home, where she could continue her documentation work without the need to keep traveling. At Rhyolite, which according to her maps should have been a major ghost town with substantial ruins and tourist facilities, Valerie found something that made her question her own sanity. The town was exactly as she remembered it from a visit 2 years earlier, complete with the concrete ruins of the Cook Bank building and the famous Bottle House. But according to the entrance sign, this was Rhyolite, Population 1, home of blogger Valerie Riggs. More disturbing was the presence of her own Toyota 4Runner parked in front of the visitor center. The vehicle was identical to hers in every detail, down to the dents in the bumper and the camping equipment visible through the rear windows. The license plate was the same, and when she looked through the driver's side window, she could see her own backpack on the passenger seat and her own coffee mug in the cup holder. Inside the visitor center, she found a display case dedicated to her work. Professional photographs showed her documenting various ghost towns, including several she was certain she had never visited. A placard described her as America's foremost expert on abandoned communities and stated that she had been living in Rhyolite for over a year, conducting research and writing her definitive book on Western ghost towns. The guest registry showed her signature dozens of times with dates spanning the past 18 months. The handwriting was definitely hers, and many of the entries included comments she might have written. Another productive day photographing the mill ruins. Found some interesting artifacts near the old school. Starting to feel like this place is really home. Valerie fled Rhyolite and tried to leave the area entirely, but found that every road led to another ghost town with more personalized signs. At Beatty, which should have been a living community with gas stations and restaurants, she found a population sign reading, "Beatty, Population 1, don't leave us, Valerie." The town was completely abandoned, with empty buildings and vacant lots. but fresh supplies had been stocked in what appeared to be a general store specifically for her use. Her cell phone, which had been receiving intermittent signals throughout the day, now showed full bars but could only connect to a single website, her own blog. The site displayed posts she had never written, photographs she had never taken, and a bio that described her as a permanent resident of the California desert who had chosen to dedicate her life to documenting ghost towns from within their communities rather than as an outside observer. The most recent blog post, dated that morning, read, "Day 847 of my residency project. I have finally found what I was looking for all along, not just to document these forgotten places, but to become part of them. The towns choose their chroniclers, and I have been chosen. Tomorrow I will delete my old life and begin my real work." As darkness fell, Valerie tried repeatedly to leave the area, but every road curved back toward the cluster of ghost towns. Her GPS showed her location as constantly changing, but the landscape remained the same, and the personalized signs grew more insistent. "Valerie belongs here. Valerie should not leave. Valerie has work to finish. Population 1, Valerie Riggs, permanent resident." At midnight, she found herself parked in front of a sign that read simply, "Home, Population 1." The town beyond the sign looked exactly like every other ghost town she had documented, but the buildings were clean and well-maintained, with warm lights glowing in the windows. Her Toyota 4Runner, the other one, was parked in front of a house that she somehow knew was hers, complete with a front porch and a mailbox bearing her name. Inside the house, she found all her belongings arranged exactly as she would have arranged them. Her cameras, her research notes, her laptop with a half-finished blog post on the screen. The post was titled, "Why I Chose to Stay," and it was written in her voice, explaining her decision to become a permanent resident of the ghost town community that had chosen her as its official chronicler. Valerie sat at the laptop and stared at the unfinished post. She could not remember writing it, but every word felt true. She had been looking for something during all her travels, some deeper connection to the places she documented. And now she had found it, or perhaps it had found her. Outside her window, the population sign glowed softly in the darkness. "Home, Population 1, Valerie Riggs, where she belongs." She began typing, finishing the blog post that would explain to her readers why the updates would be coming from a single location from now on. "Some roads," she wrote, "do not lead back home. They lead you to the home you were always meant to find." Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the mist-shrouded peaks and ancient hollows of the Appalachian wilderness with 8 disturbing accounts that will forever change how you view America's most legendary trail. In this episode, we will descend into the heart of these primordial mountains with harrowing tales of disappearances, supernatural encounters, and the primal terror that stalks those who dare to walk alone among these ancient ridges. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from the first-hand testimonies of hikers, rangers, and survivors who emerged from these mountains forever changed by what they witnessed in the deep woods. These are not campfire stories or urban legends, but authentic experiences shared by individuals whose lives were shattered by encounters with forces that defy explanation along the most remote sections of the trail. To safeguard the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the chilling truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for the most authentic and disturbing true horror content that explores the darkest corners of our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we unearth another collection of buried secrets that demand to be told. And after you listen to these accounts, share your own Appalachian Trail experiences in the comments below, because we know many of you have encountered things on these mountains that you have never spoken about. My name is Ella, and I have been documenting wildlife behavior along hiking trails for the past 8 years as part of my work with the National Wildlife Federation. I thought I had seen every kind of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the aggressive to the simply bizarre. What I witnessed last November on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina changed my understanding of how nature communicates with those who know how to listen. I was conducting a 3-day survey of bird migration patterns along a stretch of trail that runs through the Nantahala National Forest. This particular section sees very few hikers during late fall, making it perfect for observing wildlife without human interference. The area is known for its diverse ecosystem and the massive old-growth trees that tower over the narrow trail like ancient sentinels watching over secrets they have kept for centuries. On the morning of my second day, I was setting up my camera equipment at a scenic overlook when I noticed something unusual in the valley below. There was a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail where someone had obviously made camp recently. I could see the bright colors of modern camping gear scattered around the site, which struck me as odd because the area was not accessible by any marked trail that I knew of. Through my telephoto lens, I could make out what appeared to be a high-end tent, still fully erected along with camping chairs, a portable table, and other expensive-looking equipment. But there was no movement around the campsite, no sign of the people who should have been using all that gear. Something about the scene felt wrong, like stumbling across a movie set that had been abandoned in the middle of filming. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the behavior of the local wildlife. Ravens had gathered in unusual numbers around the campsite, at least 30 or 40 birds perched in the trees surrounding the clearing. They were not behaving like scavengers looking for food scraps, but rather like sentries maintaining watch over something important. Every few minutes, several of them would take flight and circle the campsite in a coordinated pattern before returning to their perches. I had studied raven behavior extensively during my career, and this was unlike anything I had ever observed. Ravens are highly intelligent birds with complex social structures, but they do not typically gather in large groups around human campsites unless there is something specific attracting them. Their behavior suggested they were guarding something or trying to communicate information about the site below. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I packed my camera and basic supplies, leaving my heavier research equipment at the overlook, and began the challenging descent into the valley. There was no established trail leading to the clearing, so I had to pick my way carefully, through dense undergrowth and over fallen logs, following what appeared to be an animal path that wound between the massive tree trunks. The ravens watched my progress with obvious intelligence, some of them flying ahead of me as if leading the way, while others remained behind as if ensuring I did not retreat. Their calls echoed through the forest in patterns that seemed almost conversational, as if they were discussing my approach and deciding whether I should be allowed to continue. As I got closer to the campsite, I began to notice other details that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The camping gear was indeed expensive and high quality, but it had been arranged in a way that suggested the occupants had left in a hurry. A camp chair was overturned and personal items were scattered around as if someone had been searching through them hastily. More disturbing was what I found when I examined the perimeter of the campsite. There were clear signs of a struggle in the soft earth around the tent. Boot prints were mixed with what looked like barefoot impressions, and the vegetation was trampled and broken in patterns that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen repeatedly while trying to escape. I noticed that the ravens had fallen silent as I entered the clearing, watching me with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus. They seemed to be waiting for me to discover something specific, and their behavior made me increasingly certain that whatever had happened here was not a simple case of campers leaving their gear behind. Inside the tent, I found personal belongings that painted a picture of the missing occupants. There were 2 sleeping bags indicating a couple, along with identification cards that showed they were experienced hikers from Virginia who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. Their names were Michael and Sarah Chen, and according to their hiking permits, they had planned to spend 5 days on this section of trail. What I discovered next made me realize that the Ravens were trying to warn me about something far more serious than abandoned camping equipment. Behind the tent, partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared to have been deliberately arranged, I found evidence that someone had been digging in the soft forest floor. The depression in the earth was roughly rectangular and about 6 feet long, the exact size and shape that would accommodate a human body. The soil that had been excavated was piled nearby, along with a small camping shovel that clearly belonged to the missing hikers. But the hole was empty, and the displaced earth had been scattered to make it less obvious to casual observation. I realized with growing horror that I was looking at a burial site that had been recently disturbed. Someone had buried something here, then returned later to dig it up and move it elsewhere. The Ravens had been guarding this location, trying to draw attention to what had happened in this remote clearing where no one would normally think to look. As I photographed the scene with my camera, documenting the evidence for the authorities, I became aware that the forest around me had fallen completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no sound of wind in the branches overhead. The unnatural quiet was broken only by the soft whisper of raven wings as more birds arrived to join the growing congregation watching me work. I was so focused on documenting the scene that I almost missed the sound of approaching footsteps. The ravens heard it first, erupting into harsh warning calls that echoed through the trees like alarm bells. Someone was making their way through the forest toward the clearing, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with the terrain. The bird's agitation told me everything I needed to know about the approaching visitor. This was not a lost hiker or a park ranger responding to my presence. The ravens were reacting to someone they recognized as a threat, someone they had encountered before in this place of violence and concealment. I grabbed my camera and quickly moved to the edge of the clearing, finding concealment behind a large fallen tree that provided both cover and a clear view of the campsite. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of branches being pushed aside and the occasional muttered curse as the person navigated the difficult terrain. When the figure finally emerged into the clearing, I understood why the ravens had been maintaining their vigil. The man was tall and heavily built, wearing camouflage clothing that was stained with what looked like dried blood. He carried a large backpack and moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been to this location many times before. He went directly to the disturbed burial site and began examining the scattered earth with obvious frustration. It was clear that he had expected to find something there that was no longer present, and his anger at the discovery was evident in his movements and the low growls of annoyance that escaped his lips. The ravens watched him with obvious hatred, some of them diving at his head and forcing him to duck and swat at them with his hands. But he seemed accustomed to their harassment, as if this confrontation was a familiar routine that played out every time he visited this place. I realized that this man was almost certainly responsible for whatever had happened to Michael and Sarah Chen, and that he had returned to move evidence that would connect him to their disappearance. The ravens had been trying to prevent this by drawing attention to the site, hoping that someone would discover the truth before he could complete his cover-up. While he was distracted by the attacking birds, I managed to photograph him from multiple angles, capturing clear images of his face and distinctive clothing. But as I was adjusting my camera settings for better lighting, I accidentally knocked against the fallen tree I was hiding behind, causing a small branch to snap with a sharp crack. The sound carried clearly across the clearing, and the man's head snapped up immediately. His eyes scanned the forest around the campsite with the focused intensity of a predator searching for prey. The ravens fell silent, as if they too understood that my discovery had put me in mortal danger. I held perfectly still, hoping that my camouflaged position would keep me hidden. But the man began moving methodically around the perimeter of the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. He moved with the patient thoroughness of someone experienced in hunting human prey, checking behind every tree and fallen log large enough to conceal a person. As he got closer to my hiding spot, I made the decision to run. I burst from concealment and crashed through the forest in the direction I hoped would take me back to the main trail, branches whipping at my face and clothes as I pushed through the dense undergrowth at reckless speed. Behind me, I could hear him giving chase, his heavy footsteps pounding through the forest, accompanied by shouts of rage that echoed off the surrounding hills. But the ravens were not finished with their involvement in this deadly game. They launched themselves at my pursuer in coordinated attacks, diving at his head and face with their sharp talons extended, forcing him to slow down and defend himself. Their intervention gave me the precious seconds I needed to reach the animal path I had followed into the valley. I scrambled up the steep slope toward the main trail, my lungs burning and my heart pounding with terror and exertion. The ravens continued their assault on the man below, their harsh cries filling the forest with sounds of battle. When I finally reached the main trail, I ran until I found a group of other hikers who helped me contact the park rangers by satellite phone. Within hours, law enforcement officers were searching the area I had described, guided by my photographs and GPS coordinates. They found the disturbed campsite and the evidence of the burial site, along with other items that connected the location to several missing hikers over the past 2 years. But they never found the man I had encountered despite an extensive search of the area. The ravens had dispersed by the time the authorities arrived, their mission apparently complete. They had successfully drawn attention to the crimes committed in their territory and ensured that evidence was preserved for investigation. Michael and Sarah Chen were never found, but their disappearance is now part of an active investigation into a serial killer who targets remote hikers in the Appalachian wilderness. The case remains open, and authorities believe he is still active in the region. I still conduct wildlife research along hiking trails, but I pay much more attention to animal behavior that seems unusual or out of place. I learned that day that ravens are not just intelligent birds, but guardians of the forest who will risk their own safety to protect the truth from being buried forever. The mountains keep many secrets, but sometimes the creatures that live there decide that certain secrets need to be revealed. My name is Jonathan, and I have been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for over a decade. I thought I knew these mountains well enough to handle anything they could throw at me. I was wrong. What happened to me last October on a remote stretch through the Shenandoah National Park changed everything I believed about being alone in the wilderness. I had planned a 5-day solo hike through one of the more isolated sections of the trail, starting at the Rockfish Gap entrance and heading north towards Swift Run Gap. The weather forecast looked perfect for late fall hiking, crisp mornings and cool afternoons with clear skies. I had done this exact route twice before, so I felt confident about the terrain and water sources. What I did not account for was the man who would turn those 5 days into the most terrifying experience of my life. The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time on the familiar trail, stopping at my usual spots for water and rest. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. I reached my planned campsite at High Top Hut just as the sun was setting behind the western ridges. The shelter was empty, which was not unusual for this time of year on a weekday. I set up my tent nearby and prepared a simple dinner, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest settling into night. It was the next morning when I first saw him. I was breaking camp around sunrise when I noticed a figure standing on the trail about 50 yards south of where I had camped. He appeared to be another hiker, wearing a dark jacket and carrying what looked like a large backpack. I waved in the friendly manner that trail hikers use to greet each other, but he did not wave back. Instead, he just stood there watching me pack up my gear. Something about his stillness made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as early morning grogginess affecting my perception. I finished packing and headed north on the trail. When I looked back after about 10 minutes of hiking, the man was gone. I assumed he had continued south on his own journey and thought nothing more of it. The morning was beautiful, with low mist hanging in the valleys and the sun filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. I made good progress toward my next planned stop at Lewis Mountain. Around midday, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook that provided sweeping views of the valley below. While I was eating my trail mix and drinking water, I heard footsteps approaching on the trail behind me. I turned to see the same man from the morning, now much closer than before. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face that suggested he spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes were well worn but appropriate for hiking, and his backpack looked expensive and professional. He approached with what seemed like a friendly demeanor and asked if I was heading north on the trail. When I confirmed that I was, he smiled and said he was going the same direction. He introduced himself as Mark and asked about my planned route for the next few days. I found myself sharing more information than I normally would with a stranger, telling him about my planned campsites and daily mileage goals. Looking back, I realized this was my first real mistake. Mark seemed knowledgeable about the trail in the area, asking specific questions about water sources and trail conditions ahead. He mentioned that he had been hiking this section for years and knew all the best camping spots, including some unofficial sites that were not marked on the standard trail maps. His conversation felt natural and friendly, the kind of encounter that makes solo hiking more enjoyable. We hiked together for the rest of the afternoon, sharing stories about previous hiking adventures and discussing the best gear for different conditions. As evening approached, we reached the area where I had planned to camp for the night. Mark suggested an alternative site about half a mile off the main trail, claiming it had better water access and more protection from the wind. Against my better judgment, I agreed to check it out. The site was indeed beautiful, nestled in a small clearing beside a clear mountain stream. We set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing and prepared dinner separately, though we continued talking across the distance. It was during dinner that Mark began asking more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, what I did for work, and whether anyone knew exactly where I was on the trail. He claimed he was just making conversation, but something about his tone made me uncomfortable. I gave vague answers and tried to change the subject, but he kept returning to questions about my personal life and hiking plans. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every small sound in the forest seemed amplified, and I found myself listening intently for any movement near my tent. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps moving around the perimeter of our campsite. They were slow and deliberate, not the random wandering of an animal looking for food. I lay perfectly still in my sleeping bag, trying to determine if the sounds were coming from Mark moving around his campsite or something else entirely. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, sometimes coming close to my tent, sometimes moving toward the stream, but always maintaining that same careful, measured pace. I never heard Mark's voice or the sound of his tent zipper, which made me increasingly certain that he was not inside his tent where he should have been. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted and on edge. Mark was sitting by the cold remains of last night's fire when I emerged from my tent, looking as if he had been awake for hours. He greeted me cheerfully and asked how I had slept, showing no signs of fatigue despite what I was certain had been his nighttime wandering. I decided to pack up quickly and get back to the main trail, claiming I wanted to make an early start to cover more miles that day. As we hiked that morning, Mark began demonstrating knowledge about my hiking habits that he should not have possessed. He mentioned that I always stopped at the same overlook for lunch, that I preferred to camp near water sources, and that I typically hiked about 12 miles per day. When I asked how he knew these details, he laughed and said he was just good at reading people. But his answers felt rehearsed, and I began to suspect he had been watching me for longer than just the previous day. The situation became truly frightening when we stopped for a rest break around mid-morning. While I was drinking water and checking my map, Mark casually mentioned that I had set up my tent in exactly the same spot where I had camped on my previous hikes through this area. He described the specific tree I had tied my food bag to and the flat rock I had used as a table. Details that would be impossible to know unless he had been watching me on those earlier trips. When I confronted him about this knowledge, his friendly demeanor changed completely. His eyes became cold and calculating, and he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. He told me that he had been following hikers on this section of trail for years, learning their patterns and habits. He said some hikers were more interesting than others, and that I had become one of his favorites to watch. I realized with growing horror that this man had been stalking me for years without my knowledge, probably during each of my previous hikes through this area. He knew my routines, my preferences, and my vulnerabilities. I was alone in the wilderness with someone who had been planning this encounter for a very long time. I told Mark that I needed to head back to the main trail immediately, but he blocked my path and suggested we continue hiking together to my planned campsite for that night. The way he said it made it clear that this was not really a suggestion. I agreed, hoping to find an opportunity to get away from him when we encountered other hikers or reached a more populated area of the trail. We hiked in tense silence for the next several hours. Mark stayed close behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing and the sound of his footsteps matching mine. Every time I tried to increase my pace, he matched it effortlessly. When I stopped to rest, he stopped too, always positioning himself between me and the direction we had come from. As afternoon turned to evening, I realized that we had not encountered a single other hiker all day, which was unusual even for this remote section of trail. Mark seemed to know exactly which routes would keep us away from other people, steering me toward lesser-used paths and alternate routes that bypassed the main camping areas. When we reached what he claimed was my planned campsite for the night, I discovered it was not anywhere near where I had intended to stop. We were in a small clearing completely surrounded by dense forest, with no visible trail markers and no sign that other hikers had ever used this location. The isolation was complete and terrifying. Mark began setting up his tent with practiced efficiency while suggesting I do the same. But instead of complying, I made the decision that probably saved my life. I told him I had forgotten something important back at our previous campsite and needed to retrace our route to find it. Before he could object, I dropped my heavy pack and ran. I crashed through the forest in the direction I thought would take me back to the main trail, branches tearing at my clothes and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. Behind me, I could hear Mark shouting and giving chase, his voice echoing through the trees with a rage that confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. I ran for what felt like hours, completely lost and panicked, until I finally stumbled onto a section of the main trail that I recognized. From there, I was able to navigate back to a road crossing where I flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the nearest town. At the local police station, I learned that Mark's real name was David Crawford, and he had been wanted in connection with several missing hikers in the region over the past 3 years. The authorities had been looking for him but had never been able to establish a pattern or predict where he would appear next. They found my abandoned pack at the campsite, along with detailed notes about my hiking habits and routes written in David's handwriting. There were also similar notes about other hikers, some of whom had been reported missing and never found. David Crawford was never caught. He disappeared back into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, possibly still out there watching and following other unsuspecting hikers. I never returned to that section of trail, and I never hike alone anymore. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, remembering the sound of those careful footsteps circling my tent in the darkness. And I wonder how many other hikers he had watched and followed before he made his move. The mountains I once loved now feel like a hunting ground where predators wait patiently for the right moment to reveal themselves. That is why I am sharing this story. If you hike alone on remote sections of trail, trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the ones we prepare for. Three. My name is Ryan, and I have been solo camping in remote wilderness areas for over 15 years. I pride myself on being prepared for any situation these mountains can present, from sudden weather changes to dangerous wildlife encounters. But what happened to me last December near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina taught me that some things in these ancient hills cannot be explained by logic or survival training. I had chosen a particularly challenging section of trail for my winter camping trip, a remote area that sees almost no foot traffic during the colder months. The isolation was exactly what I needed after a difficult year at work, and I was looking forward to several days of complete solitude among the snow-covered peaks. My planned campsite was located at a high-elevation clearing that offered spectacular views of the surrounding ridges during clear weather. The forecast had called for possible snow showers, but nothing that would prevent an experienced winter camper from enjoying a safe trip. I had packed all the necessary cold weather gear, including a 4-season tent rated for extreme conditions and a sleeping bag designed for temperatures well below zero. My food supplies were calculated for 5 days with an extra day of emergency rations, and I carried multiple methods of fire starting and water purification. The hike to my chosen campsite took most of the day, with the trail becoming increasingly challenging as I gained elevation. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon turned to evening, and by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to spend the night, a light snow had begun to fall. The flakes were small and dry, creating a peaceful atmosphere as they drifted through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. I set up my camp efficiently, taking advantage of the remaining daylight to establish a secure base for what I expected would be a cold but comfortable night. The clearing was sheltered on 3 sides by dense forest, with the 4th side opening onto a dramatic view of the valley far below. I positioned my tent to take advantage of the natural windbreak while maintaining access to the scenic overlook. As darkness fell, the snowfall intensified significantly. What had been a light dusting became a steady accumulation that began to muffle all sound from the surrounding forest. I prepared a hot dinner and settled into my tent for the evening, listening to the gentle whisper of snow against the fabric walls and feeling grateful for the warmth of my sleeping bag. It was around midnight when I first heard the voices calling through the storm. At first, I dismissed the sounds as wind moving through the trees, creating audio illusions that can trick the mind during long winter nights in isolated locations. But as I listened more carefully, the sounds began to resolve into what seemed like human voices shouting for help. Somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite, the calls appeared to be coming from multiple directions, sometimes from the valley below, sometimes from the ridges above, and occasionally from the dense forest that surrounded my clearing on 3 sides. The voices sounded desperate and frightened, calling out words that were almost but not quite clear enough to understand through the muffling effect of the falling snow. My first instinct was to help whoever was in distress, but something about the situation made me hesitate. The voices seemed to be calling from locations that would be impossible for hikers to reach during a snowstorm, particularly in the middle of the night when visibility was essentially 0. The ridge lines they appeared to be coming from were accessible only by technical climbing routes that no sane person would attempt in these conditions. I unzipped my tent and listened more carefully to the pattern of the calls. They came in waves lasting for several minutes before fading away, then returning from a different direction with renewed intensity. The voices sounded like they belonged to different people, men and women of various ages, all calling for help with the same desperate urgency. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the acoustic properties of the sounds. They seemed to carry farther and clearer than should have been possible in the heavy snow, reaching my ears with a distinctness that defied the physical laws governing how sound travels through dense precipitation. The voices also lacked the breathless quality that would be expected from people struggling through deep snow in freezing temperatures. Despite my growing uneasiness about the situation, I could not ignore what might be genuine calls for help from lost or injured hikers. I dressed quickly in my warmest layers and grabbed my headlamp, GPS device, and emergency supplies. If there were people in trouble somewhere in the storm, I had a moral obligation to attempt a rescue even if the circumstances seemed strange. I left my tent and began moving in the direction of the most recent calls, which appeared to be coming from a ridgeline about half a mile northeast of my campsite. The snow was now falling heavily enough to limit visibility to just a few yards beyond my headlamp beam, and the accumulation was making travel increasingly difficult with each step. The voices continued to call as I struggled through the deepening snow, always seeming to come from just ahead of my current position. But no matter how far I traveled toward the sounds, they never seemed to get any closer. Instead, they maintained the same distance and clarity, as if the sources were moving away from me at exactly the same pace I was moving toward them. After what felt like an hour of difficult hiking through terrain that was becoming increasingly treacherous, I realized that I had traveled much farther from my campsite than I had intended. The GPS showed that I was now over a mile from my tent, having followed the voices up steep slopes and along narrow ridgelines that would be dangerous even in good weather conditions. The calls were still coming from ahead of me, but I was beginning to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The voices never paused for breath, never showed signs of exhaustion despite calling continuously for hours, and never responded when I shouted back offering help and asking for their location. More disturbing was the realization that the voices were leading me along paths that would take me farther and farther from safety. Each time I tried to turn back toward my campsite, the calls would intensify from a different direction, creating an almost irresistible urge to continue following them deeper into the wilderness. I stopped at a small clearing and checked my GPS again, discovering that I was now dangerously close to an area marked on my map as containing steep cliffs and unstable rock formations. The voices were calling from just beyond the tree line ahead, in a direction that my map showed led directly to a series of dramatic drop-offs that would be invisible in the current weather conditions. With growing horror, I realized that the voices were not coming from people in distress, but were somehow intended to lure me toward the dangerous cliff area where a single misstep would result in a fatal fall. The pattern of the calls, always maintaining the same distance and always leading me in directions that took me away from safety, suggested a deliberate attempt to guide me into mortal danger. I turned off my headlamp and stood in complete darkness, listening to the voices continue their desperate pleas for help. Without the light to guide me, I could focus entirely on the acoustic properties of the sounds, and what I heard convinced me that these were not human voices at all. They had a hollow, echoing quality that suggested they were being produced by something that did not possess human vocal cords or respiratory systems. The voices also demonstrated knowledge of my position and movements that would be impossible for lost hikers to possess. They always called from locations that would draw me away from my campsite and toward increasingly dangerous terrain, adjusting their apparent positions based on my responses in ways that suggested intelligent coordination rather than random panic. As I stood motionless in the darkness, the voices began to change in character. The desperate calls for help gradually transformed into what sounded like attempts at conversation, with individual voices asking questions about my location and intentions. They wanted to know where I was camped, how long I planned to stay in the area, and whether anyone knew my exact route. The interrogation quality of these new vocalizations convinced me that I was dealing with something that was actively hunting me, using the universal human response to calls for help as a way to draw victims away from safety and into situations where they could be easily eliminated. The voices were mimicking human distress calls with the same predatory intelligence that allows certain animals to imitate the sounds made by their prey. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward my campsite, using my GPS to navigate in the darkness rather than risk using my headlamp to signal my position. The voices continued calling, but now they seemed frustrated and angry rather than desperate. They were calling my name, which I had never provided, and making increasingly specific references to my equipment and planned route. The journey back to my tent took nearly 2 hours, with me stopping frequently to check my GPS position and listen for changes in the pattern of the calls. The voices followed my retreat, always staying close enough to be heard but never close enough to be seen. They seemed to know exactly where I was despite my attempts at stealth, commenting on my progress and making threats disguised as offers of help. When I finally reached my campsite, I discovered that my tent had been disturbed during my absence. The guy lines had been loosened, causing the tent to sag and allowing snow to accumulate on the rainfly in patterns that would eventually cause structural failure. My food cache had been opened and scattered around the clearing, and my backup supplies had been removed from their protective containers and exposed to the storm. The damage was too systematic to be the result of curious wildlife, and too specifically targeted to be caused by random wind or snow accumulation. Something had deliberately sabotaged my camp while I was being led away by the voices, ensuring that I would return to find my shelter compromised and my supplies contaminated or destroyed. I spent the remainder of the night inside my partially collapsed tent, listening to the voices circle my campsite in the darkness. They no longer bothered with pretending to be human calls for help, instead producing sounds that seemed designed to create maximum psychological terror. The vocalizations included inhuman screams, mechanical grinding noises, and what sounded like recordings of previous victims pleading for their lives. At dawn, the voices finally stopped, and the snowstorm moved on to reveal clear skies and brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh accumulation. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and began the hike back to the trailhead, abandoning my planned multi-day trip in favor of immediate escape from whatever had terrorized me through the night. During the descent, I discovered that the area around my campsite was marked with symbols carved into the bark of surrounding trees. The symbols appeared to be recent and were arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of territorial marking or warning system. Each symbol was accompanied by initials and dates going back several years, suggesting that other hikers had encountered similar experiences and felt compelled to leave evidence of their presence, I reported the incident to park authorities, but was told that similar reports had been filed by other winter campers in the Grandfather Mountain area over the past decade. The official explanation was that extreme weather conditions and isolation can cause auditory hallucinations and paranoid behavior in solo hikers, leading to misinterpretation of natural sounds as threatening voices. But I know what I heard that night was not a hallucination. Something in those mountains uses human voices as bait to lure people away from safety and into situations where they disappear forever. The carved symbols I found suggest that some hikers have managed to survive their encounters, but others have not been so fortunate. I still go winter camping, but never alone, and never in areas where other hikers have reported hearing unexplained voices calling through the darkness. Some mountains hold secrets that are better left undiscovered. My name is Chloe, and I have always believed that the mountains hold memories of everyone who has ever walked their trails. What happened to me last spring on a section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia proved that some of those memories refuse to stay buried in the past. I was completing a solo day hike on a lesser-known trail that connects to the main Appalachian Trail system through the Blue Ridge Mountains. The route is popular with local hikers but rarely sees visitors from outside the region, making it perfect for someone seeking solitude and quiet contemplation. The morning had started clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes the mountains feel alive with new growth and possibility. About 3 miles into my hike, I encountered a section of trail where thick fog had settled in the valley, creating an ethereal atmosphere that transformed the familiar forest into something mysterious and otherworldly. The mist hung between the trees like curtains, limiting visibility to just a few yards in any direction and muffling all sounds except the soft drip of condensation from the branches overhead. It was while I was navigating through this fog that I first saw the woman. She appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of me, materializing out of the mist as if she had been walking there all along. At first glance, she appeared to be another hiker, but as I got closer, I noticed several details about her appearance that seemed out of place for a modern trail user. The woman was wearing a long dress that appeared to be made of dark wool or similar heavy fabric. The dress reached almost to her ankles and had long sleeves with fitted cuffs that were typical of clothing from a much earlier era. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate upswept style that would have been fashionable in the late 1800s, and she wore what looked like leather boots that laced up to mid-calf height. Despite the unusual clothing, the woman appeared to be in distress. She was walking slowly and seemed disoriented, frequently stopping to look around as if searching for something or someone. Her movements had the quality of someone who was lost and becoming increasingly desperate to find her way. As I approached her, I called out a greeting and asked if she needed help. The woman turned toward me with obvious relief and began speaking in a voice that carried a slight accent I could not immediately identify. She told me that she was looking for her children, who had wandered off while they were picking berries in the woods near their home. She explained that she had been searching for them since early morning and was becoming frightened that something terrible had happened to them. The woman described her children in detail, a boy named Thomas who was 8 years old and a girl named Mary who was 6. Both wearing clothes that would have been typical for rural children in the 19th century. What struck me as odd about her story was that she seemed to believe we were much closer to settled areas than we actually were. She kept referring to nearby farms and a local schoolhouse that should have been within walking distance, but I knew from my map that we were miles from any permanent structures or residential areas. I gently explained to her that we were in a designated wilderness area where no one lived permanently, and that the nearest town was over 10 miles away, by road. But rather than accepting this information, She became increasingly agitated and insisted that her home was just beyond the next ridge, in a valley where her husband was waiting for her to return with the children. The woman began walking again, moving with determined purpose in a direction that led away from the main trail and toward increasingly rough terrain. She seemed to know exactly where she was going despite the heavy fog that made navigation nearly impossible. I followed her, partly out of concern for her safety and partly out of curiosity about how she had ended up in this remote location dressed in period clothing. As we walked, she continued to describe her search for the missing children, providing details about their personalities and habits that painted a vivid picture of a loving mother's desperate concern. She told me about Thomas's fascination with small animals and how he often lingered behind the family when they went berry picking because he stopped to examine every interesting insect or bird he encountered. She described Mary as a cautious child who rarely strayed far from her mother's side, making it unusual for her to have wandered off without permission. The woman theorized that Thomas had discovered something particularly interesting, and that Mary had followed him to see what had captured his attention. Her descriptions were so detailed and emotionally authentic that I found myself becoming invested in the search for these children, despite growing evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the entire situation. The fog seemed to be getting thicker as we moved deeper into the wilderness, and the temperature was dropping in a way that felt unnatural for the time of day and season. We had been walking for what felt like an hour when the woman suddenly stopped and pointed ahead into the mist. She claimed she could see her house in the distance, describing a 2-story wooden structure with a stone chimney and a large garden where she grew vegetables for her family. But when I looked in the direction she was indicating, I could see nothing but more forest disappearing into the fog. The woman began calling out to her children by name, her voice carrying a desperate urgency that made my heart ache with sympathy. She called for Thomas and Mary, repeatedly pausing between calls to listen for any response, but the only sounds that came back were the echo of her own voice and the continued dripping of moisture from the trees around us. It was then that I noticed something that made me question everything about this encounter. Despite the heavy fog and the fact that we had been walking for over an hour through difficult terrain, the woman showed no signs of physical exertion. She was not breathing heavily. Her clothing showed no signs of moisture from the damp air, and her elaborate hairstyle remained perfectly arranged despite the humidity and our movement through dense undergrowth. More disturbing was the realization that I had not seen any footprints behind her as we walked, even though the soft forest floor should have clearly shown the impressions left by her heavy boots. My own footprints were clearly visible in the damp earth, but there was no evidence that she was actually making physical contact with the ground as she moved. I stopped walking and watched her more carefully, trying to understand what I was actually witnessing. The woman continued moving ahead of me, still calling for her children, but her movements had a floating quality that suggested she was not entirely bound by the same physical laws that governed my own motion through the forest. When I called out to her, asking her to wait for me, she turned back with an expression of confusion and sadness that seemed to look right through me. She asked if I had seen her children, but when I tried to explain my growing concerns about our situation, she did not seem to hear my words. Instead, she resumed her search with renewed determination, moving deeper into the wilderness. I made the decision to stop following her and instead began trying to navigate back to the main trail using my GPS device. But when I checked the screen, I discovered that it was showing my location as several miles from where I believed we had been walking, in an area that my map indicated was largely inaccessible due to steep terrain and dense vegetation. As I stood trying to understand how I had become so disoriented, the fog began to clear slightly, and I realized that the woman had disappeared. One moment she had been visible just ahead of me, and the next moment she was gone, as if she had never been there at all. Her voice could no longer be heard calling for the children, and the forest had returned to its normal quiet morning atmosphere. I eventually found my way back to the main trail and completed my hike without further incident. But the encounter left me with questions that demanded answers, so I began researching the history of the area where I had met the mysterious woman. What I discovered in local historical records was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. In 1873, a woman named Catherine Mitchell had lived with her family in a valley that was later flooded to create a reservoir for a nearby town. According to newspaper accounts from that time, Catherine had taken her two young children, Thomas and Mary Barry, picking in the woods near their home on a foggy spring morning. The children had wandered away from their mother and become lost in the dense forest. Catherine spent days searching for them, refusing to give up hope even as the local community organized search parties to help look for the missing children. Neither the children nor Catherine were ever found, and the case remained one of the region's most enduring mysteries. The historical accounts described Catherine as a devoted mother who was known for her distinctive style of dress and elaborate hairstyles that reflected her upbringing in a prosperous family before her marriage to a local farmer. I believe that I encountered Catherine Mitchell that morning in the fog, still searching for her children after more than 150 years. Unable to accept that they are beyond her reach, the mountains keep their memories alive, and some losses are too profound to be healed by the passage of time. The fog still settles in that valley on spring mornings, and sometimes hikers report hearing a woman's voice calling for Thomas and Mary in the mist. My name is Anthony, and I have been an experienced backpacker for 20 years. I thought I knew everything about navigation, survival, and the psychological challenges of solo wilderness travel. Last August, I attempted what should have been a simple 5-day section hike through the George Washington National Forest in Virginia. What happened to me during those 14 days changed my understanding of how the mountains can trap a person in ways that defy logic and explanation. I had planned a straightforward route covering approximately 60 miles of the Appalachian Trail, starting at Rockfish Gap and ending at Swift Run Gap. The section was familiar to me from previous hikes, and I carried detailed topographic maps, a GPS device, and a compass as backup navigation tools. My food supplies were calculated for 6 days, with an additional day of emergency rations, more than enough for the planned duration of the trip. The first day went exactly as expected. I made good time on the well-marked trail, stopped at familiar landmarks, and reached my planned campsite at the scheduled time. The weather was perfect for hiking, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that made the journey enjoyable rather than challenging. I set up camp confident that I would complete the route without any significant difficulties. On the second morning, I began to notice subtle signs that something was wrong with my navigation. Trail markers that I remembered from previous hikes seemed to be in slightly different positions, and familiar landmarks appeared to have changed in small but noticeable ways. A distinctive rock formation that should have been on my left was now on my right, and a stream crossing that I remembered being shallow was now deep enough to require careful wading. I dismissed these discrepancies as failures of memory, assuming that my recollections from previous hikes were less accurate than I had believed. The GPS continued to show my position on the planned route, and the compass readings were consistent with my expected direction of travel. There was no reason to suspect that anything was fundamentally wrong with my navigation. By the third day, the inconsistencies had become impossible to ignore. I was encountering sections of trail that I was certain I had never seen before, despite having hiked this route multiple times over the past decade. The terrain was similar to what I expected, but the specific details were wrong in ways that suggested I was somehow following a parallel path through unfamiliar territory. More disturbing was the realization that I had not encountered a single other hiker since beginning the trip. The section of trail I was supposedly following normally sees moderate foot traffic, and I should have met at least a few other backpackers or day hikers during my first 3 days. The complete absence of other people began to feel unnatural and threatening. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that challenged my understanding of where I was and how long I had been hiking. I reached a campsite that I was certain I had used on my first night, complete with the distinctive fire ring and flat sleeping area where I remembered setting up my tent. But according to my GPS and the distance I had covered, I should have been 40 miles from that location. I searched the area carefully and found clear evidence of my previous occupation of the site. The remains of my campfire were exactly where I had left them, and I even found a small piece of gear that I remembered dropping during my first night. But the discovery made no sense given my understanding of my route and progress over the past 4 days. That night, I heard my own voice calling from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. The voice was unmistakably mine, calling my name and asking for help in tones of increasing desperation. The sounds seemed to come from different directions, sometimes from the trail ahead, sometimes from the forest to either side, and occasionally from behind me in the direction I had come. I remained in my tent knowing that whatever was producing those sounds was not actually me, despite the perfect replication of my voice and speech patterns. The calling continued for hours, sometimes pleading for rescue, sometimes angrily demanding that I come out and explain why I was hiding. The voices knew details about my life that only I should know, referencing specific memories and experiences with accuracy that was both impressive and terrifying. By morning, I had consumed more food than I should have used during my first 4 days, despite the fact that my appetite had been normal and I had not been eating larger portions than usual. When I checked my supplies, I discovered that I had only 2 days of rations remaining, along with the emergency day I had packed as backup. The GPS continued to show my position as being on my planned route, but the displayed mileage indicated that I had covered nearly twice the distance that should have been possible given the terrain and my normal hiking pace. The device showed that I had been hiking for 7 days rather than 4, despite my clear memory of only 4 nights spent in the wilderness. I made the decision to abandon my planned route and head directly toward the nearest road, hoping to reach civilization before my food supplies were completely exhausted. But when I tried to navigate toward the highway that should have been only a few miles to the east, I found myself returning to the same landmarks repeatedly, as if I was walking in large circles despite maintaining a consistent bearing on my compass. The forest itself seemed to be shifting around me, presenting different configurations of trees and terrain each time I passed through what should have been the same location. Trails that led uphill in one direction somehow led uphill when I turned around and retraced my steps. Water flowed in directions that contradicted the topography, and the sun seemed to move across the sky in patterns that did not match the expected seasonal progression. On what I believed was my 8th day, I discovered another campsite that contained evidence of my previous occupation. This time, I found the remains of multiple fires in different locations around the site, suggesting that I had used this same location several times during my journey. Personal items that I had no memory of leaving behind were scattered around the area, including pieces of gear that I was certain were still in my backpack. The psychological stress of the situation began to take a severe toll on my mental state. I started to doubt my own memories and perceptions, wondering if I was experiencing some form of breakdown that was causing me to misinterpret normal wilderness experiences as supernatural phenomena. But the physical evidence of my multiple visits to the same campsites could not be explained by psychological factors alone. My food ran out on what my journal indicated was day 11, though my memory suggested I had been hiking for only 8 days. I began rationing my emergency supplies while desperately searching for any sign of human civilization or other hikers who might be able to help me navigate out of whatever maze I had become trapped in. It was on day 13 that I finally encountered another person. A day hiker appeared on the trail ahead of me, walking in the opposite direction with the confident stride of someone familiar with the area. When I called out to him for help, he stopped and listened to my explanation of being lost and disoriented for nearly 2 weeks. The day hiker looked at me with obvious concern and told me that I was less than 2 miles from a major road crossing where I could flag down a ride to the nearest town. He gave me detailed directions that seemed simple and straightforward, pointing out landmarks that I should follow to reach safety within a few hours. But when I followed his directions, I found myself back at one of the familiar campsites I had used multiple times during my ordeal. The day hiker was nowhere to be seen, and there was no evidence that anyone had recently passed through the area. I began to suspect that he had been another manifestation of whatever force was keeping me trapped in this endless loop. On day 14, I finally escaped by abandoning all attempts at logical navigation and simply walking downhill while ignoring my compass and GPS readings. This approach eventually led me to a stream that I followed to a road where I was able to get help from passing motorists. When I was rescued, I learned that I had been reported as an overdue hiker 6 days earlier, and search teams had been looking for me throughout the area where I thought I had been trapped. But the searchers found no trace of my presence in any of the locations I described, and my GPS track showed a confused pattern of overlapping circles and impossible routes that covered hundreds of miles in terrain that should have limited me to much shorter distances. The medical examination I received after my rescue showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness for exactly 14 days. But my planned 5-day hike should never have lasted that long, and I still cannot explain how I became trapped in a section of forest that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. I no longer hike alone in unfamiliar areas, and I always carry emergency communication devices that allow me to call for help regardless of my location. Some parts of these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding cannot grasp, and getting lost in them means more than simply losing the trail. My name is Natalie, and I have always been drawn to the hidden places that most hikers never discover. While others stick to marked trails and established campsites, I prefer to explore the forgotten corners of these ancient mountains where few have ventured. What I found last September in the caves beneath Blood Mountain in Georgia proved that some places are forgotten for very good reasons. Blood Mountain has always held a reputation for being one of the most mysterious and unsettling peaks along the entire Appalachian Trail. The name itself comes from a Cherokee legend about a great battle between rival tribes that stained the mountain's rocks red with blood. Modern hikers often report feeling uncomfortable while camping in the area, describing an oppressive atmosphere that seems to press down on them like a physical weight. I was drawn to explore Blood Mountain specifically because of these stories. As an amateur speleologist, I was particularly interested in the extensive cave systems that honeycomb the mountain's interior. Most of these caves are unmarked and uncharted, accessible only to those willing to venture off established trails and navigate through dense forest to reach hidden entrances. My research had identified several potential cave openings on the eastern slope of the mountain, in an area that sees virtually no foot traffic from regular hikers. I planned a 3-day expedition to locate and explore these caves, carrying specialized equipment including headlamps, ropes, and emergency supplies designed for underground exploration. The hike to reach the cave system took most of the first day, following game trails and unmarked paths through increasingly dense forest. The atmosphere on Blood Mountain was immediately different from other peaks I had explored. The forest was unusually quiet, with very few bird calls or sounds from small animals. Even the wind seemed muffled, creating an unnatural stillness that made every sound I made feel amplified and intrusive. I found the first cave entrance late in the afternoon, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and partially blocked by fallen rocks. The opening was larger than I had expected, easily wide enough for a person to enter without crawling. Cool air flowed out of the cave mouth, carrying an unusual smell that I could not immediately identify. The cave entrance led to a narrow passage that descended steeply into the mountain's interior. My headlamp revealed smooth limestone walls that showed clear evidence of water erosion over thousands of years. After about 50 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. It was in this main chamber that I made my first disturbing discovery. The walls were covered with carved symbols that appeared to be very old, etched deep into the limestone with tools that had left distinctive marks. The symbols were not random scratches or graffiti, but appeared to be organized into patterns that suggested some kind of written language or ceremonial markings. The carvings covered nearly every available surface in the chamber, from floor to ceiling, creating an overwhelming display that would have taken years to complete. Some of the symbols were simple geometric shapes, while others were more complex designs that resembled abstract representations of human or animal figures. What made the symbols particularly unsettling was their obvious age, combined with evidence that they had been maintained and refreshed over time. Some sections showed clear signs of recent work, with sharp edges and clean lines that contrasted with the weathered appearance of older carvings. Someone had been regularly visiting this cave to continue the work of whoever had originally created this underground gallery. As I photographed the symbols for later study, I noticed that many of them were arranged around small alcoves carved into the chamber walls. These alcoves appeared to be designed to hold objects, and several still contained items that made my blood run cold. There were animal bones arranged in specific patterns, collections of what appeared to be human teeth, and small bundles of organic material that had been preserved by the cave's cool, dry environment. The alcoves were clearly part of some kind of ritual system that had been active for a very long time. The variety of materials and their different states of preservation suggested that offerings had been placed here repeatedly over many years, possibly decades or even longer. I decided to explore one of the side passages leading deeper into the cave system, hoping to find more conventional geological features that would make the expedition feel less like trespassing in someone's underground temple. The passage I chose was smaller than the main chamber, requiring me to crawl in some sections, but eventually opened into another large space. This second chamber was even more disturbing than the first. The walls were covered with symbols similar to those in the main chamber, but these carvings showed clear evidence of being much more recent. Some were still sharp enough to catch and reflect my headlamp beam, as if they had been completed within the past few months. More alarming was the discovery of a makeshift altar in the center of the chamber. The structure was built from carefully stacked stones and appeared to be actively maintained, with fresh materials arranged on its surface. There were bones that still showed traces of flesh, plant materials that had not yet dried completely, and other organic substances that I preferred not to examine too closely. The altar was surrounded by a circle of symbols carved directly into the cave floor, creating a ceremonial space that was obviously still in regular use. Wax drippings around the perimeter indicated that candles or torches were frequently burned in this location, and the air carried the faint smell of smoke mixed with other odors that I could not identify. As I was documenting this second chamber, I began to hear sounds coming from deeper in the cave system. At first, I thought the sounds might be water dripping or wind moving through hidden passages. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that something large was moving through the tunnels beyond my current location. The sounds had a rhythmic quality that suggested deliberate movement rather than random animal activity. Whatever was making them was approaching my location slowly and methodically, pausing occasionally as if listening for sounds that would reveal my presence. I turned off my headlamp and waited in complete darkness, hoping that whatever was in the caves with me would pass by without detecting me. But the sounds continued to get closer, accompanied by what seemed like whispered voices speaking in a language I did not recognize. The voices had a chanting quality that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony was taking place in the deeper parts of the cave system. The words were too faint and distorted by the cave acoustics for me to make out individual syllables, but the rhythm and tone suggested that multiple people were involved in whatever was happening. I realized that I had stumbled into an active ceremonial site that was still being used by people who would not appreciate the presence of an uninvited observer. The recent carvings, fresh offerings, and ongoing ritual activity meant that I was trespassing in a sacred space that was very much alive and protected. I began moving as quietly as possible back toward the cave entrance. But the passage seemed longer and more complex than I remembered from my initial exploration. I took several wrong turns and found myself in unfamiliar chambers that I was certain I had not seen before. The sounds of movement and chanting continued throughout my attempted escape, sometimes seeming to come from directly ahead of me, sometimes from behind, and occasionally from passages that ran parallel to my route. Whatever group was conducting their ceremony in the deeper caves was clearly aware of my presence and was possibly trying to cut off my retreat. When I finally reached the main chamber, I discovered that my route to the entrance was blocked. Fresh stones had been carefully arranged across the passage, not enough to completely seal it, but sufficient to make exit difficult and noisy. Someone had been in this chamber while I was exploring the deeper caves, and they had deliberately tried to trap me underground. I managed to move enough of the stones to squeeze through the passage and reach the cave entrance, but the effort took nearly an hour and made enough noise to alert anyone in the area to my location. When I finally emerged into daylight, I discovered that my camping gear had been disturbed and rearranged in patterns that matched the symbols I had seen carved in the cave walls. My tent had been collapsed and the fabric arranged in geometric shapes. My food supplies had been removed from their containers and organized into small piles that formed circular patterns around my campsite. Even my hiking boots had been repositioned to point toward the cave entrance in a way that seemed deliberately symbolic. I packed my remaining gear as quickly as possible and hiked out of the area without stopping to rest or eat. The entire descent from Blood Mountain felt like a retreat from something ancient and powerful that did not want its secrets exposed to the outside world. I never reported my discovery of the cave system to park authorities, partly because I had no desire to return to the area, and partly because I suspected that whatever was happening in those underground chambers was something that should be left undisturbed by outside interference. Blood Mountain keeps its secrets for good reasons, and some mysteries are better left unsolved by those who value their safety more than their curiosity. My name is Alexander, and I have been photographing wildlife in remote wilderness areas for over 12 years. I thought I had encountered every type of animal behavior these mountains could produce, from the curious to the territorial to the simply unpredictable. What stalked me for 3 days through the backcountry of Tennessee last October challenged everything I believed about the intelligence and intentions of the creatures that call these ancient forests home. I was conducting a solo photography expedition in the Cherokee National Forest, specifically targeting black bears during their pre-hibernation feeding period. This time of year offers some of the best opportunities to observe and photograph bears in their natural habitat, as they focus intensively on building fat reserves for the coming winter months. I had planned a 4-day backpacking trip to reach areas where bears congregate around natural food sources. The first day of hiking took me deep into old-growth forest where human presence is minimal and wildlife behavior remains largely uninfluenced by contact with people. I established my base camp near a stream that provided both water access and excellent sight lines for wildlife observation. The area showed abundant signs of recent bear activity, including fresh scat, claw marks on trees, and well-used trails leading to nearby berry patches. On the second morning, I encountered my first bear of the trip. The animal appeared at the edge of a clearing about 100 yards from my position, moving with the characteristic shambling gait of a large male black bear. I estimated his weight at over 300 pounds, making him one of the largest bears I had ever observed in the wild. I immediately began photographing him through my telephoto lens, excited by the opportunity to document such an impressive specimen. What struck me as unusual about this bear was his apparent awareness of my presence combined with his complete lack of typical bear behavior in response to detecting a human. Most bears will either flee immediately upon sensing people or display obvious signs of agitation and territorial posturing. This bear simply stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me with an intensity that felt distinctly unnatural. The bear remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, never taking his eyes off my position. During this time, he showed no interest in foraging for food or engaging in any of the normal activities that would bring a bear to this type of location. He seemed to be studying me with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. When the bear finally moved, he did not retreat into the forest as I expected. Instead, he began walking slowly along the perimeter of the clearing, maintaining the same distance from my position while changing his angle of observation. His movement had a deliberate quality that suggested he was positioning himself for a better view rather than simply passing through the area. I continued photographing his behavior but began to feel increasingly uncomfortable about the situation. The bear's actions seemed more calculated and purposeful than anything I had observed in over a decade of wildlife photography. He was clearly aware of my exact location and was actively choosing to remain in the area despite my presence. After completing his circuit of the clearing, the bear disappeared into the forest. But rather than feeling relieved by his departure, I had the distinct impression that he had not actually left the area but had simply moved to a position where I could not see him. The feeling of being watched persisted long after he had vanished from sight. That evening, as I prepared dinner at my campsite, I noticed movement in the tree line surrounding my location. The same bear was visible between the trees, positioned about 50 yards away and maintaining his vigil over my activities. He remained motionless except for the occasional movement of his head as he tracked my movements around the campsite. The bear's behavior was so unusual that I began to question whether I was actually observing a normal wild animal or something else entirely. His posture was wrong for a typical black bear, appearing more upright and human-like than the forward-leaning stance characteristic of his species. His movements also seemed too fluid and coordinated, lacking the somewhat clumsy quality that makes bears appear endearing despite their size and power. Throughout the night, I was aware of the bear's continued presence around my campsite. I could hear him moving through the forest in slow, measured steps that suggested he was patrolling the perimeter of my location rather than simply wandering through his territory. The sounds never moved far enough away to indicate that he had lost interest in my presence. On the third day, the bear began following me as I moved through the forest. He maintained a consistent distance of approximately 100 yards, always staying just within sight but never approaching close enough to pose an obvious threat. When I stopped to photograph other wildlife or scenic locations, He would stop as well and wait for me to resume hiking. The bear's tracking behavior was so precise and persistent that I began to suspect he had some specific purpose in mind beyond simple curiosity about my presence. He seemed to be herding me in a particular direction, appearing ahead of me on certain trails while remaining behind me on others, effectively controlling my route through the forest. Most disturbing was the bear's apparent ability to predict my movements and intentions. He would position himself at locations where I planned to stop for rest or photography before I had made any obvious indication of my intentions. He seemed to understand not just where I was going, but why I was going there and what I planned to do when I arrived. By the afternoon of the third day, I had become genuinely frightened by the bear's behavior. His actions suggested a level of intelligence and planning ability that went far beyond anything documented in scientific literature about black bear cognition. He was not simply following me out of curiosity, but was actively stalking me with what appeared to be deliberate intent. I decided to change my planned route and head directly toward the nearest marked trail that would take me back to civilization. But when I attempted to alter my course, the bear began displaying signs of agitation for the first time since our initial encounter. He moved closer to my position and began making vocalizations that did not sound like typical bear communications. The sounds he produced were lower and more complex than normal bear vocalizations, with a rhythmic quality that almost resembled attempts at speech. The vocalizations seemed designed to communicate specific information rather than simply express emotion or territorial claims. When I continued moving toward the main trail despite his obvious displeasure, the bear began following me more closely and aggressively. He would appear directly on the path ahead of me, forcing me to alter my route, then position himself to block alternative routes that would take me toward areas of higher human activity. I realized that the bear was actively trying to prevent me from leaving his territory, using his size and presence to control my movements in ways that kept me isolated in remote areas where no other people would be likely to encounter us. His behavior suggested that he had specific plans for our interaction that required continued isolation from outside interference. On my final night in the forest, the bear abandoned all pretense of maintaining distance from my campsite. He positioned himself less than 30 yards away and remained there throughout the night, never sleeping or relaxing his vigilance. His eyes reflected the light from my campfire with an intelligence that seemed distinctly non-animal in its focus and intensity. I spent that night awake and alert, keeping my fire burning bright and maintaining constant awareness of the bear's position. Several times during the night, he rose to his full height on his hind legs and remained standing for extended periods, a posture that black bears typically maintain only briefly for scent detection or threat assessment. At dawn, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and began a rapid hike toward the main trail. The bear followed me for the first several miles, but gradually fell behind as I maintained a pace that was faster than his preferred travel speed. When I finally reached the marked trail system, he disappeared into the forest without any sign of his previous intense interest in my activities. I reported the encounter to park rangers, but was told that unusual bear behavior is not uncommon during pre-hibernation feeding periods when the animals are under stress to build adequate fat reserves. The rangers suggested that the bear had simply become habituated to human presence and was exhibiting curiosity rather than threatening behavior. But I know what I observed during those 3 days was not normal animal behavior. The bear's actions showed a level of planning, intelligence, and purposeful intent that suggested something far more complex than a wild animal's response to encountering a human in its territory. I still photograph wildlife in remote areas, but I no longer venture into regions where large predators might view me as something other than a temporary intrusion into their domain. Some animals in these mountains operate according to rules that human understanding has not yet discovered. And crossing paths with them can lead to encounters that challenge our assumptions about the natural world. My name is Abigail, and I have been a trail guide and wilderness educator for over 15 years. I thought I knew every established path, unmarked route, and hidden trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains. What happened to me last June proved that some trails in these ancient hills exist according to their own rules, leading hikers not just to different places but to different realities entirely. I was conducting a solo reconnaissance hike to evaluate a new route for guided tours when I discovered a trail that appeared on none of my maps or GPS systems. The path was well maintained and clearly marked with professional trailblazers, but it branched off from the main Appalachian Trail in a location where I was certain no side trail had existed during my previous visits to the area. The trail markers were painted in the standard white rectangular blazes used throughout the Appalachian Trail system, but they included additional symbols that I did not recognize from any official trail marking system. The symbols appeared to be directional indicators, but they pointed in directions that did not correspond to any known destinations or trail intersections. What initially attracted me to explore this mysterious trail was its obvious quality and maintenance. The path was expertly constructed with proper drainage, stable footing, and clear sight lines that indicated professional trail building techniques. Someone had invested considerable time and resources into creating a hiking experience that rivaled the best sections of the official trail system. The trail began with a gentle ascent through mixed hardwood forest, typical of the region. The walking was pleasant and the scenery was spectacular, offering views of distant ridges and valleys that I had never seen from this particular vantage point. The path seemed to follow natural contours of the landscape while providing access to scenic overlooks and interesting geological features. After hiking for what I estimated was about 3 miles, I encountered the first group of other hikers using the trail. They were a family consisting of 2 adults and 3 children, all properly equipped with hiking gear and displaying the confident demeanor of experienced trail users. When I asked them about their destination and how they had learned about this particular route, they gave me information that made no sense. They told me they were hiking from Damascus, Virginia to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, following what they described as the traditional Appalachian Trail route. But the location where I had encountered them was nowhere near the established trail corridor between those 2 points, and their described itinerary would require them to cover impossible distances given the terrain and their apparent pace of travel. When I tried to explain that they seemed to be off the main trail system, they looked at me with confusion and showed me their guidebook and maps. The materials they carried appeared to be official Appalachian Trail publications, but they described a route that differed significantly from the established trail I knew well. Their maps showed the path we were currently following as the main trail, with the route I considered standard marked as an alternate or emergency bypass. The family continued on their way, heading in a direction that should have led them into impassable terrain according to my understanding of the local topography. But they walked with confidence and certainty as if they were following a well-known and frequently traveled route toward a destination they expected to reach without difficulty. As I continued exploring the mysterious trail, I encountered several more groups of hikers, all of whom gave me similar information about their routes and destinations. They all believed they were following the standard Appalachian Trail, and they all carried maps and guidebooks that showed this path as the official route through the region. Most disturbing was the discovery that these hikers represented different time periods of trail use. Some carried modern lightweight gear and used current terminology for trail features and regulations. Others had equipment and clothing that appeared to be from several decades earlier, and they referenced trail conditions and landmarks that had not existed for many years. One elderly hiker I encountered claimed to have been following this route annually for over 40 years, beginning in the 1970s when trail maintenance and marking systems were less standardized than today. He described changes to the trail over the decades that matched the historical development of the official Appalachian Trail. But he was describing changes to a route that I was certain had never existed. As the day progressed, I began to realize that I was not simply exploring an unmarked trail, but had somehow entered a version of the trail system that operated according to different rules than the reality I thought I understood. The other hikers I encountered were not lost or confused, but were following a legitimate trail that existed parallel to the one I knew. The landscape itself seemed to shift subtly as I continued hiking. Familiar landmarks appeared in unexpected locations, and the views from overlook showed terrain configurations that differed from my memory of the regional topography. The changes were not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but accumulated over time to create the impression that I was walking through a familiar area that had been somehow altered or rearranged. By late afternoon, I had hiked much farther than should have been possible given the terrain and my normal pace. My GPS showed that I had covered over 15 miles, but my physical condition and energy level suggested that I had hiked only half that distance. The device also showed my location as being several miles from where I believed I was based on the landmarks and trail features I could observe. When I tried to turn back toward my starting point, I discovered that the trail behind me had changed. The path I had followed to reach my current location was no longer visible, and the blazes that had guided me this far now pointed only in the forward direction. The trail seemed to exist only as a one-way route that prevented hikers from returning to their point of origin. I encountered a group of 3 hikers who claimed to have been walking this same trail for several weeks, covering thousands of miles while maintaining the same pace and energy level throughout their journey. They described passing through dozens of towns and trail landmarks, but their physical appearance and the condition of their gear suggested they had been hiking for only a few days at most. When I asked them about their experiences on the trail, they told me stories about encounters with other hikers, trail conditions, and weather events that spanned multiple seasons and years. They seemed to be experiencing time differently than normal, living through extended periods of trail life while aging only days or weeks in the process. The 3 hikers invited me to continue traveling with them, claiming that the trail led to destinations and experiences that could not be reached by following conventional routes. They described a network of interconnected paths that existed throughout the Appalachian Mountain System, accessible only to those who abandoned traditional concepts of distance, time, and destination. As evening approached, I made the decision to leave the trail despite the apparent impossibility of retracing my route. I pushed through the forest in what I believed was the direction of the main trail system, fighting through dense undergrowth and difficult terrain in an effort to reach familiar territory. The journey back to known trails took several hours of challenging bushwhacking, but eventually I emerged onto a section of the official Appalachian Trail that I recognized. When I checked my GPS, I discovered that I was only about 2 miles from where I had first encountered the mysterious trail, despite having hiked over 15 miles during the day. I attempted to relocate the trail entrance the following day, bringing additional maps and GPS equipment to document its location and characteristics. But despite searching the exact area where I remembered finding the trailhead, I could find no evidence that such a path had ever existed. The forest showed no signs of trail construction or maintenance, and there were no blazes or markers in the area. I reported my experience to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and local park authorities, but was told that no unofficial trails existed in the area I described. The maps and GPS data I had recorded during my hike showed impossible routes through terrain that should have been impassable, and my photographic documentation revealed landmarks and trail features that did not correspond to any known locations. I have continued to search for the trail during subsequent visits to the area, but have never again encountered the path or the hikers who seem to exist within its alternate reality. Sometimes I wonder if they are still out there, walking endless miles through a version of these mountains where time and distance operate according to different rules, following trails that lead to destinations that exist only for those who know how to find them. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and some of the paths that wind through these ancient hills lead to places that cannot be found on any map or reached by conventional means. For those who stumble onto these hidden routes, the journey becomes more important than the destination, and the trail itself becomes a way of life that transcends the normal boundaries of time and space. Some hikers never find their way back from trails that exist beyond the edges of our ordinary world, and perhaps they no longer want to return to a reality that seems limited compared to the infinite possibilities they have discovered.